Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I didn't believe in anything strange, spirits, haunted places, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. That is, until the night we went camping deep in the forest. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend away from everything, but what we encountered still haunts me. We found a spot off the beaten trail, miles from the nearest campground. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. It felt peaceful, remote, and untouched by the outside world. We set up camp beneath towering pines, built a fire, and shared stories late into the night. It wasn't until we fell silent that I realized something was off. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the gentle hum of the breeze, had stopped. Completely. The night felt unnervingly still. Even my friends, usually loud and talkative, grew quiet, as though we were all waiting for something we couldn't name. Around midnight, the wind returned, but it was no longer gentle. It howled through the trees with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. The fire flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the forest floor. I shifted uneasily in my seat, glancing around. The shadows seemed to twist and move in ways they shouldn't. That's when we heard it, the sound of someone walking through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't match the sound of any animal I knew. It wasn't the crunch of leaves or the soft padding of paws. It was something heavier, more human, but not quite right. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered. We all nodded, our nerves taut. I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. "Maybe it's an animal," I offered weakly, though none of us truly believed it. The footsteps grew louder, circling our camp. They came from all directions, and it didn't take long to realize whoever, or whatever, was moving wasn't trying to hide. They wanted us to hear. I stood up, heart racing. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but my legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. My friends followed my gaze as we watched shadows creep closer through the underbrush. Then it happened. From the trees, something emerged. Something that wasn't human, but not quite a creature either. It was tall, far too tall for any person, with limbs that bent unnaturally and skin that seemed to ripple like water. Its face was smooth, almost featureless, except for two black, hollow eyes that gleamed in the firelight. "Run," someone whispered, and we all turned to flee. But the figure didn't move like we did. It glided silently through the trees, faster than we could ever hope to outrun it. We could hear it, feel its presence as though it was right behind us, always just a step away. We made it back to the car, slammed the doors shut, locked them, and peeled away from the woods as fast as we could. None of us spoke. We couldn't. The image of that thing, its endless eyes watching us from the shadows, was burned into my mind. Even now, years later, I can still feel its gaze. I don't know what it was, or why it followed us. All I know is that sometimes, some places leave scars deeper than memory. I was in the middle of a road trip driving through endless stretches of desert. The sun had set hours ago, and now it was just me and the empty highway. There wasn't a single car in sight, nothing but the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone. I had been driving for what felt like forever, searching for the next gas station or even a small town, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the horizon like a thin line against the sky. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and the only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine. I was starting to feel uneasy. Everything about this trip had felt off since the moment I left. The air was dry and still, not a whisper of wind or even the faintest rustle of leaves. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The low fuel light blinked on, warning me that I needed to find something soon. My eyes searched the horizon, hoping for a sign of life, a flicker of light, anything. but the desert was vast and empty, stretching out in all directions. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw something. In the distance, a faint glow of light, maybe a gas station or a motel. I couldn't tell which from this far away. But hope surged through me, and I pushed my foot down harder on the gas pedal. As I got closer, the light became clearer. It wasn't a gas station or a motel. It was a building, old and crumbling, its walls covered in cracked paint. A small, flickering sign hung above the entrance, barely legible in the fading light. It read, "The Oasis." My stomach twisted. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But at this point, I didn't care. I needed fuel, water, something, anything to keep going. I parked my car in front of the building and stepped out, the heat still radiating off the pavement. The air smelled dry and dusty, the kind of scent that clings to your throat. The front door creaked open as I pushed it. Inside, it was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs dangling from the ceiling. The shelves were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust. The coolers were all shut, ice long melted. It felt more like a ghost town than a place meant to serve travelers. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. No reply. I moved through the aisles, hoping to find a supply of water or something to drink. But there was nothing. The only sound was my footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. It was eerie. The silence felt oppressive, as if the desert had swallowed up everything, leaving only this empty space behind. I made my way to the back of the store, where an old counter sat, covered in cobwebs. A small radio sat there, its antenna bent, dust coating its surface. I picked it up, hoping maybe I could get some signal, but static hissed from the speaker. Nothing but dead air. Desperation started to set in. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had no idea how far I was from anything. I was isolated, completely alone in this vast, empty desert. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed from the direction of the front door. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, steady. It wasn't the wind. It didn't sound like something natural. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the front, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside, but somewhere inside the building. I couldn't tell where exactly. It sounded like it was right in front of me, but there was nothing there. I turned to look back at the counter, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape standing behind the glass. It wasn't human. It had no distinct features, just a shadowy, distorted form. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I didn't know how that was possible. My breath hitched as I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved closer, slow, deliberate. I could hear its footsteps, even though they shouldn't have made a sound on the dust-covered floor. I bolted for the door, fear clouding my vision. The creaking footsteps followed me, closer now, as though it was right behind me. I threw open the door and sprinted into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was miles down the road, the building a distant blur behind me. My car waited, humming quietly, the only sound I could hear. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night or if it was even real, but sometimes, when I drive through the desert, I wonder if I'll see that building again, or if something else will come for me. I never believed in curses, at least not until that day at the old vineyard. It was a hot summer afternoon, the kind where the sun feels too close and everything feels quiet. My friends and I decided to visit the vineyard just outside town, a place that had always been talked about in hushed whispers. The old stories said the vineyard was abandoned after a family tragedy, that something had happened there long ago, a fire, a disappearance, or something worse. We drove up the cracked gravel road, surrounded by nothing but vines stretching endlessly into the horizon. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, but we ignored it, eager for the adventure. We parked and wandered through the rows of withered grapevines, their leaves brittle and brown, like they hadn't seen care in decades. As we made our way deeper into the vineyard, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. The silence was absolute. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the heavy, oppressive quiet of the vines pressing in around us. We eventually stumbled upon an old barn, its roof partially caved in, vines crawling up the weathered walls. We ventured inside, careful not to disturb the cobwebs hanging from the rafters. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood beneath our feet. It was there, in that musty barn, that we found the old trunk. It was rusted shut, sitting in the corner like it had been forgotten for decades. My friend, Mark, pushed at the lid, but it wouldn't budge. "Let's leave it," I said, but something about the trunk drew us in, like a magnet. Mark grabbed a crowbar from the corner and pried open the lid. Inside, we found faded photographs, yellowed letters, and an old diary. The diary had a name written in faded ink: Elena. We flipped through the pages, reading about her life on the vineyard, her family, her dreams, and the slow, tragic unraveling of their once thriving land. Elena had written about losing everything, of strange occurrences in the vineyard, and of a curse that had followed her family for generations. "I thought this was just a legend," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The more we read, the heavier the air seemed to become. It was like the barn itself was pushing down on us. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine as I read something that stopped me cold. They say the vineyard takes what it wants, and what it wants is you. Before I could even process what I'd read, a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the barn, like something had snapped. We all turned, eyes wide, hearts pounding. The trunk slammed shut on its own, with a resounding crash that reverberated through the silence. Something was wrong. Something had changed. As we stepped outside, the vineyard felt different. The sun seemed to dim, and the once quiet air buzzed with a low, unnatural hum. I glanced back at the barn, but it was gone, replaced by a thick wall of vines that hadn't been there before. We ran. The vineyard stretched endlessly, but we didn't stop, feet pounding the dry dirt, hearts hammering in our chests. Every step felt like we were running through a dream. Everything around us twisted and distorted. That's when we heard it. Whispers. Voices on the wind, calling to us. Soft at first, then louder and more insistent. They weren't human voices. They were cold, hollow, and filled with a dark hunger. We didn't stop, even when the vines began to close in around us. We could feel something. Watching. Waiting. As if the land itself was alive. Breathing and yearning. When we finally broke free from the vineyard, the town was nowhere to be seen. The road that had brought us there had vanished. We wandered aimlessly, lost and terrified, the echoes of those whispers still lingering in our ears. To this day, we've never spoken of what happened that afternoon. The vineyard isn't talked about anymore, and the old town avoids it entirely. But I know one thing. There's something out there, something waiting, buried deep in the vines, and I'm not sure it's ever truly gone. It was a quiet afternoon when my friends and I decided to visit a secluded beach. The sun was high in the sky, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was the only thing breaking the silence. We had heard about this beach from someone who had described it as peaceful, remote, and the perfect place to escape from the noise of the world. We loaded up the car and drove for hours, leaving the familiar city behind. The drive was long, but the scenery changed from bustling streets to endless fields and towering cliffs as we got further from civilization. By the time we parked, we were surrounded by nothing but sand, sea, and the distant cries of seagulls. The beach was stunning. The sand stretched out in front of us, seemingly untouched by human footsteps. The waves crashed gently, and the smell of salt water filled the air. We set up camp, unpacked our things, and made a small fire to cook some food. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the beach, and we relaxed, enjoying the quiet. But something felt off. It wasn't the usual peace you'd expect from a place like this. It was more than just solitude. There was a strange stillness, almost like the world had stopped breathing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the quiet of being far from everything. As the sun set, casting brilliant orange and pink hues across the horizon, we heard something strange, a faint, muffled sound, almost like faint whispers carried by the breeze. We exchanged glances, but none of us said anything at first. Maybe it was just the wind, we told ourselves, but the whispers didn't go away. The darkness fell quickly after the sun disappeared, and that's when things got weirder. We were sitting by the fire, talking quietly, when a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. It looked like a man, but there was something wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though its bones were bending the wrong way. We all froze, unable to look away as the figure walked toward us, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The whispers became clearer now, but they weren't words. They were like a low, guttural sound, almost a chant. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound that we could understand. It just kept coming, step by step, dragging one foot behind the other. Panic set in, but none of us could move. We watched, unable to look away as the figure came closer. The sound of the waves grew louder, but the figure didn't stop. It was getting closer to the edge of the firelight, and I could see its face, if you could even call it that. Its skin was stretched too tight, as if it had been stretched thin like old paper, with hollow sunken eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, staring at us with those lifeless black eyes. The whispers grew louder, almost a wail now, and the wind howled. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it turned and walked back into the darkness, vanishing into the shadows without a trace. We were too afraid to speak, too terrified to move. The fire crackled, and we sat there, shivering in the cold night, listening to the sound of the waves. The whispers had stopped. The figure was gone. We never saw anything else that night, but to this day, I still hear those whispers in my dreams. There was something about that beach, something ancient, something that should have stayed hidden beneath the waves. It started as an ordinary evening. I was driving home after spending the day clearing out my grandmother's old attic. The house had been untouched for decades, filled with boxes of forgotten memories. It had been a long, dusty day, and now I was finally heading back. The sun had set hours ago, and the country roads were quiet, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The radio had been static for the past few miles. I didn't mind. The road ahead was barely lit by the faint glow of my headlights, casting long shadows that danced across the trees lining the sides of the road. It was peaceful, except for the growing unease that had been settling in my chest since I left the house. About halfway home, the road curved sharply, and ahead, I noticed something unusual. A figure stood at the edge of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening. It was a woman, I could tell even from a distance. She wore a long, flowing dress that billowed slightly in the wind. She was staring directly at my car, unmoving. I slowed to a crawl, unsure what to do. As I passed her, my heart pounded harder. I glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. She was still standing there, motionless, as if frozen in place. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, soft but persistent. It came from the back of my car, barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the engine. I slowed even further, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I kept glancing into the mirror but saw nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. The knocking continued, growing louder now, more urgent. I didn't dare stop. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? Some kind of mechanical noise? But it didn't sound mechanical, it was too deliberate. And then, just as I was about to pull over, the knocking stopped. For a long stretch, there was silence, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for something, anything. It wasn't until I neared the edge of town that I saw her again, the woman from before, standing by the side of the road. This time, she was closer, and in the moonlight I could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, black holes staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized she wasn't just standing there, she was walking. But it wasn't the slow, deliberate steps of a living person. It was as if she was drifting, gliding with unnatural ease. I tried to tell myself it was just some wandering spirit, a hallucination maybe. But the fear clawing at my chest was real. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. As I passed her, I braced myself for the sound of her voice, but it never came. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my house, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and didn't bother looking back. I didn't go out the next night, or the one after that. And I've never seen that woman again. But some nights, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of knocking. I've always loved hiking, the kind of adventure that gets you far away from the noise of the city. So one weekend, I decided to explore a trail that few people talked about. It was located deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and valleys so remote, the maps barely showed any signs of civilization. My plan was simple. Hike all day, set up camp, and enjoy the peace and quiet. The trailhead was nothing more than a narrow dirt path hidden behind a row of thick trees. The first few hours were perfect. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines, birds chirped, and the air was crisp and fresh. The trail became steeper as I ascended, but I didn't mind. I relished the solitude, letting the quiet envelop me. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to find a spot to set up my tent. I chose a small clearing near a stream, tucked away from the trail. It was picturesque, surrounded by towering evergreens and the soft trickling of water. I pitched my tent, unpacked some snacks, and settled down with a book, taking a deep breath of fresh mountain air. The silence was soothing at first, but as the day wore on, it started to feel oppressive. There was no wildlife, no rustling in the trees, no distant sounds of animals. It was as if the forest itself had gone completely still. I tried to push it aside, convinced I was imagining things. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, I decided to take a short walk by the stream. The water was clear and cold, the perfect spot to reflect. I stood there, mesmerized by the way the light danced on the surface until I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. It wasn't the cool mountain air, it was something else entirely. I looked around, and the forest had become unnervingly silent. Even the breeze had stopped. The only sound now was the rushing water of the stream. I shook off the uneasy feeling and turned back toward my tent. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood there, perfectly still, staring at me. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. The head was tilted at an odd angle as if it couldn't quite move properly. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and unnatural. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I stood there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, the stillness pressing in on me. I grabbed my pack and rushed back to the tent, every sound echoing too loudly in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. The wind returned, but it howled now, as if the forest itself was alive. Shadows danced around my tent, flickering in and out of view. Every creak of the tent fabric made me jump, my breath quickening with every passing second. At dawn, I packed up as fast as I could, leaving my campsite behind. I didn't care about the trail, about taking in the sights. All I wanted was to get back to the safety of the familiar world. As I stumbled down the trail, my heart still racing, I looked back one last time. The forest was still as quiet and empty as before. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever had been there, watching me, was still out there, waiting. It started on a warm summer evening. I decided to take a long walk through a park near my apartment. It wasn't particularly special, just one of those city parks with paved paths, trees, and a small pond that people like to visit on weekends. I wasn't expecting much, just some fresh air and a bit of peace. As I walked, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows from the trees. The place was mostly deserted, save for a few scattered families and couples enjoying the cool evening. I passed a group of kids playing near the pond, their laughter echoing off the water. It was peaceful, almost serene, and I welcomed the quiet. I hadn't wandered far when I noticed something strange. A bench further along the path was occupied by a figure sitting completely still. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone deep in thought, taking a moment to rest. But as I got closer, I saw that there was no movement, no indication that they were alive. I stopped a few paces away, studying them from a distance. The figure was slouched forward, their head bowed as if lost in thought. But something wasn't right. Their posture wasn't relaxed. It was unnatural. They sat there, motionless, not responding to the world around them. Even the gentle evening breeze seemed to avoid disturbing them. I stood there, unsure whether to approach. Something felt off, like they were not supposed to be there. Slowly, I took a step closer, my breath coming a little quicker. The closer I got, the more I realized that the figure wasn't breathing. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe they were asleep, but how could they sit like that, so completely still? I glanced around, trying to gather my thoughts. There were no signs of life anywhere nearby. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for me. My instinct was to leave, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. A quiet voice in my head told me to stay, that I couldn't just walk away from this. I stepped closer, my breath shallow as I tried to make out any detail, anything that could tell me they were alive. That's when I saw it. The face, pale, void of any expression. It wasn't the stillness that terrified me most, but the eyes. They were open, but they didn't reflect light, didn't seem to see. There was no life behind them, only emptiness. I took another hesitant step forward, my heart pounding harder now. The figure didn't move. I reached out slowly, trembling fingers brushing against the arm. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like they had been there for ages. Terror surged through me, but before I could turn and run, a faint whisper reached my ears, barely audible above the silence. It was a voice, hollow and distant. "Don't leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. The park was still empty, the fading light of the sun casting long shadows. I looked back at the figure whose gaze seemed to follow me as I backed away. With every step, I felt as though something was pulling at me, drawing me closer again. I forced myself to turn and run, my legs carrying me away from the figure, from the park, from whatever had been watching me. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the park was silent again. No sign of the figure, no echo of the voice, only the fading hum of the city in the distance. I didn't go back to that park, and to this day I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to leave. I never expected a simple road trip with friends to turn into something so terrifying. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, a drive to an old abandoned lighthouse by the coast, miles from civilization. We thought it'd be fun, something adventurous, but that trip is burned into my memory forever. We left in the early afternoon, 4 of us packed into a beat-up car, the windows rolled down as we blasted music and laughed. The drive was long and uneventful, winding through the countryside with only the occasional stretch of trees and empty fields. By the time we arrived at the old lighthouse, the sun was already setting, casting everything in a soft, eerie glow. The lighthouse stood tall and weathered, its windows dark and shattered. It had been abandoned for decades, locals avoiding it after countless stories of strange sightings and disappearances. But we were young and naive, more interested in the thrill of exploring something unknown. We made our way up the worn, steep staircase that led to the top of the lighthouse. The wind howled through the cracked windows, and the sounds of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below echoed around us. The view from the top was breathtaking, until I noticed something in the distance. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. A figure, distant, barely visible against the darkening sky. It stood there, unmoving, watching us. My stomach sank. I nudged my friend, whispering, but before I could say anything, the figure turned and vanished behind the cliffs. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was just our imagination, or maybe someone else exploring the area. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The wind picked up again, louder now, like something was urging us to leave. We returned to the car and headed back, the drive back feeling longer and more oppressive than the one there. The fields and trees seemed to loom, shadows stretching unnaturally across the road. It wasn't until we were a few miles down the winding path that things started to get strange. The radio crackled to life, static filling the air. We all froze. There was no signal out here, no reason for it to be on. I reached out to turn it off, but the sound didn't stop. The static continued, shifting into something more than noise, a voice. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying. It was muffled, distorted, like something trapped in the wires. But then I heard it clearer. Turn back. The voice was cold, hollow, and deep. My friends were frozen, staring at me. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. It repeated again, louder this time. Turn back. You shouldn't be here. The car began to shake, as if the very road was trembling beneath us. I wanted to scream, to pull over, but the car wasn't responding. It just kept moving, as if something was forcing us forward. We reached a stretch of road where the trees thickened, blocking out the sky. The shadows became heavier, darker. I could barely make out the road anymore. Then I saw it. Those figures again standing by the side of the road just out of sight. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They were watching us. The voice returned, louder, more frantic now. Turn back. I slammed on the brakes, but it was no use. The car continued, the trees closing in around us. I could hear the whispers now, indistinct but growing louder. I felt a cold, oppressive pressure bearing down on me. Let us go, I whispered, my voice shaking. But no one answered. The figures grew closer, their shadows blending into the dark. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car stopped. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in silence. The static on the radio faded, and the world felt still, as if everything had paused, waiting. We didn't move. We couldn't. I stared out into the blackness, my friends motionless beside me. The figures were gone, but the whisper of the voice echoed in my head. Turn back. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house, nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke, I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. Come outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural. Wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friends' rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." It started as a simple evening hike. My friend and I had planned it months ago, just to escape the noise of the city and breathe some fresh air. We chose a trail deep in the woods, one that wasn't too far from civilization, but far enough that we'd feel the stillness of nature. The sun was setting as we parked our car. The trees stood tall and dense, casting long shadows over the narrow dirt path. We were excited, walking side by side, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional call of birds. After a few hours, we reached a small clearing. It was quiet, except for the distant sound of a stream we could faintly hear. We stopped to catch our breath, sitting on a fallen log, watching the last of the sunlight fade behind the trees. That's when I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, barely distinguishable from the shadows standing at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it might be a tree or a trick of the light, but it wasn't. It was too tall, too human. I nudged my friend, pointing silently. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It was like it was waiting, as if it had been there the entire time, just watching. "Hey," I whispered. "Do you see that?" My friend squinted in the direction I was pointing. "What is that?" His voice was barely a whisper. We both stared at the figure, feeling a chill run down our spines. It remained still, motionless. It wasn't walking toward us, but it wasn't leaving either. Without thinking, we grabbed our things and started to back away. The figure stayed put, unmoving, watching us as we moved further down the trail. The closer we got to the main path, the louder the sounds of nature returned. Birds, rustling leaves, the stream nearby. But that figure, it was like it didn't belong. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally reached our car. My friend looked back, his face pale. "Did you feel like we were being followed?" he asked. I nodded, gripping my keys tightly. Something wasn't right about that. We never spoke of it again, but to this day, I wonder who, or what, that figure was, and if it's still out there, waiting. I still can't explain what happened that night, but I know it changed me. It started as an ordinary evening, one I'll never forget. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other but no one really talked. I lived in a small apartment building that sat on the edge of town. There was a small green space between my building and the one next door, a small, overgrown park that most people seem to forget about. That night, I decided to go for a walk. Nothing strange about that, just me, some headphones, and a desire to clear my head. The air was cool, the streets nearly deserted. As I wandered toward the park, something about the atmosphere felt off. It wasn't just the silence or the empty streets. It was a deeper, more unsettling feeling, like the world had shifted slightly off kilter. I arrived at the park and noticed how different it felt from the last time I'd been there. The grass was overgrown, weeds pushed through the cracks in the pavement. The air smelled strange, almost metallic like blood. I ignored it, telling myself it was just the city noise creeping into my thoughts. I took a few steps into the park, the faint glow of the streetlights flickering. Suddenly, I heard something, the sound of footsteps. My heart jumped as I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was no one, just the empty path, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I shook my head, assuming it was my imagination, and started walking again. The crunch of gravel under my shoes felt too loud. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing at the far end of the park beneath one of the dim streetlights. It wasn't moving, just standing there, head tilted, staring at me. I froze. There was something off about the figure. It wasn't human, at least not in any way I could comprehend. The shape was distorted, elongated, like a tall black silhouette but with no discernible features. No eyes, no mouth, just pure darkness. The way it stood felt unnatural, as if it didn't belong to this world. I couldn't look away. My legs felt like stone, frozen in place as I watched this thing. It didn't seem to move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. Then, as if sensing my fear, the figure shifted, just slightly. Its body contorted in a way that seemed impossible, unnatural. It leaned toward me, and I swear I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't want to wait around to find out what would happen next. I turned and bolted, my breath ragged as I sprinted back toward the street. My mind raced, trying to convince me that I had imagined the figure. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back inside my apartment, locked safely behind the door. I sat there, the lights off, waiting for morning. My hands trembled as I replayed the figure in my mind. I don't know what I saw that night, but it wasn't human, and whatever it was, I can feel it still watching, waiting. It was late summer, and I decided to take a day off to explore the old abandoned amusement park. No one had been there in years, and the place had become a local legend. I remember hearing whispers about it being haunted, but I always dismissed those tales as just folklore. The park sat just a few miles from town, hidden between the trees, its entrance overgrown with weeds and ivy. When I arrived, the sight of rusting roller coasters and decayed ticket booths sent a chill through me. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to dull grays and greens. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breathing feel too loud. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I began exploring, walking through the empty park, my footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. There was a sense of emptiness so profound, it felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the park had been waiting for someone like me to come back. The longer I wandered, the more unsettling it became. The rides loomed above, their rusted tracks creaking softly in the wind. I passed the old Ferris wheel, its once bright lights now dull and flickering weakly. The carousel had lost its once lively tunes, now reduced to the faintest of echoes. I decided to check out the haunted house ride, the most infamous attraction. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Dark Carnival." I hesitated, standing at the entrance, my heart thudding in my chest. The thought of venturing inside made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside. The first few steps felt normal enough, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I could hear distant whispers, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I came to a part of the ride where mirrors used to reflect the illusion of endless hallways. But, instead of reflections, I saw something far more disturbing. Shadows that stretched and writhed as if they were alive. My breath hitched, and I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. The further I explored, the more the whispers became distinct. They weren't voices, but something far more sinister. Low, echoing murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The walls around me seemed to pulse faintly, as if the place itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward and fell, landing hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw something on the floor. A black handprint, impossibly large, as if made by something inhuman. My stomach twisted as I realized the prints led deeper into the maze of the haunted house. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The shadows felt closer now, watching, waiting. I pressed on, hearing the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was there was feeding off my fear. Finally, I emerged from the dark maze and found myself back in the open air, beneath the pale light of the moon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I glanced back toward the entrance of the haunted house. The whispers were now louder, as if they were surrounding me. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless by the entrance, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the exit, every step feeling like it might be my last. The figure didn't follow, but I could still hear the whispers in my ears, clearer than ever. The next morning, I drove past the park on my way home. The place seemed just as desolate as before, but something felt different. The whispers still echoed in my head, and I swear I could hear them even now, as if whatever I encountered had found a way into my mind, and I could never escape it. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at home, the kind of day when the world slows down and you finally have a chance to relax, the kind of day you take for granted, never expecting anything unusual to happen. I live alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. It's nothing fancy, just a cramped place with thin walls and old wooden floors that creak underfoot. Most of my neighbors are long gone, or at least that's what it felt like. The quiet was almost deafening, only broken by the occasional car passing by on the distant road. That day, I decided to stay in and watch some old movies, something to distract me from the creeping sense of boredom. Around 3 p.m., I popped a DVD into the player and sank into the worn-out couch. The room was dim, the sunlight filtering through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a while, it was peaceful. I was lost in the flickering images on the screen when something made me glance toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The street outside was still. No cars, no pedestrians. Just that unrelenting silence. But then, a faint movement caught my eye. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker at the edge of the glass. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A figure. It wasn't standing still. No, it was shifting, pacing. Something tall and thin, too thin. Its form seemed distorted, almost like it wasn't fully there. The more I stared, the more I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human. I wasn't even sure it was real. My gut told me to look away, but I couldn't. I was locked in place, unable to move, the figure growing clearer with each passing second. Its face, if it had one, was blank. Just an empty expanse where eyes should have been. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe. Then it tilted its head toward me, as if it could sense my gaze. My pulse quickened. I felt exposed, like it could see right through me. I wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt paralyzed by some invisible force. The figure raised one long, spindly arm, its fingers dragging against the glass. I could hear the faint scratch like nails on a chalkboard, but it wasn't loud. It was almost whispered. The sound reverberated in my head, filling the room with a sense of unbearable dread. Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure moved closer to the window, its form bending, folding in strange, unnatural ways. Its steps were slow, deliberate, as if it were studying me. The closer it got, the less it resembled anything human. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. Its head tilted even farther, as if inspecting me from afar. I could feel its gaze burrowing into my soul. It didn't blink, didn't move. Time seemed to stretch. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. The silence in the room had become oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Then it spoke, or rather, it didn't. I heard no words, no sound at all, but somehow I understood what it was saying. The message was clear. You can't escape. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The figure didn't need to speak. It wasn't just standing there. It had crossed over somehow, into my world. It knew I couldn't run. I could feel its presence in my very bones, a suffocating, malignant force that had no intention of leaving. I knew, without a doubt, that it was watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Eventually, the figure retreated, vanishing into the shadows. The silence remained, but the sense of its presence lingered, like a breath on my neck. I never saw it again, but I know it's still there, waiting. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. "Look." I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. It was a summer evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned amusement park just outside of town. The place had always been off limits, but rumors had circulated for years about how eerie it had become after being shut down. Overgrown with weeds, faded signage, and cracked pavement stretching as far as the eye could see, the park was a relic from a time long gone. We figured we'd go check it out, just for the thrill of it. The sun was setting as we made our way through the rusting entrance gates. Everything about the place felt surreal. The Ferris wheel, once a shining beacon of joy, stood now as a towering skeletal structure swaying gently in the breeze. Most of the rides were broken or tilted at odd angles, their once bright colors dulled and faded by years of neglect. We wandered further into the park, snapping photos, laughing and making jokes about how haunted it probably was. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, and the wind carried the creaking sounds of metal swaying. Even the smallest things, the chirping of insects, the soft rustling of leaves, felt amplified, as if the silence of the park had grown too loud. At some point, we decided to split up. It wasn't exactly planned, but we were curious to explore more, and with no cell service, it didn't matter much. The sun was nearly gone now, and the park was shrouded in deepening shadows. My group stayed near the old roller coaster, the tracks buckling in several places, making the whole structure look like it could collapse at any moment. That's when we heard it, the sound of distant laughter. It wasn't ours. It was coming from further inside the park, echoing through the hollow spaces between rides and buildings. I froze, the laughter sharp and unsettling, like it didn't belong here. "What the hell?" I whispered, glancing at my friends. They shrugged it off as more of the creepy ambiance, but something in the sound felt wrong, like it wasn't the playful kind of laughter you expect in an amusement park. It was hollow, distorted, as if coming from something that shouldn't be alive. We stood there, unsure, but before we could move, we heard it again. Closer this time. Louder. The sound seemed to be circling the park, following us without ever appearing. The chill in the air grew stronger, and the excitement that had been buzzing earlier was replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Let's head back," someone said, their voice quivering. We all agreed, eager to leave, but as we began walking, the laughter came again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. It was multiple voices. They echoed all around us, overlapping, as if we were surrounded. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The path we had taken seemed longer than it should have, and with each step, the laughter grew louder and more distorted. Shadows danced in the fading light, shifting unnaturally in ways that no wind or movement could create. Then came the creaking of the Ferris wheel. It was slow at first, like something winding itself into motion, but we didn't hear the sounds of it turning, only the groans of metal under unseen pressure. Suddenly, it stopped. The laughter had ceased entirely. We turned around, breath catching in our throats. Standing beneath the giant wheel, framed in the dim light, was a figure, tall, pale, and eerily still. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but there was no mistaking the outline of its form. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us, waiting. We didn't stay long enough to figure out what it was. We ran, heart pounding, sprinting through the park as fast as we could, the echoes of our own footsteps and the distant laughter still ringing in our ears. We never looked back. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye, a faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the doorframe, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." I had always loved the quiet solitude of the forest. Growing up, I would spend hours walking through the trees, lost in my thoughts, letting the sounds of nature calm my mind. But that day, something felt different, off in a way I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to take a long hike. The weather was perfect, warm, sunny, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead and started walking, following the familiar path that twisted deeper into the woods. The forest felt vast and peaceful, as it always did, but today there was a strange stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence that seemed unnatural. After about an hour, I came to a clearing, a large, flat expanse of moss-covered ground surrounded by towering trees. I decided to stop there and rest for a while. I lay back on a bed of soft grass, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. Not just birds, but everything. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. My heart began to pound as I sat up and looked around. The air felt heavy, like something was looming just beyond my view. I stood and started walking again, though my sense of peace was gone. The silence wasn't just unnerving, it felt wrong. I felt like something was watching me, like the forest wasn't supposed to be this quiet. My footsteps became quicker, my breathing faster. Hours seemed to pass, though I wasn't sure how much time had actually gone by. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I needed to turn back, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. As I walked, I came to a narrow footbridge over a shallow creek. I hesitated before stepping onto it, the creaking wood beneath my feet making me pause. The water below was eerily still, almost too still. I looked down into the water, but there was nothing there. No fish, no movement at all. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite right either, distorted as if the water itself was not quite real. It wasn't until I reached the other side that I realized how quiet the creek had been. There wasn't even the sound of flowing water. I shook my head, trying to push away the sense of dread that was creeping up on me. The trees seemed to close in around me as I continued walking. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against my shoulders, the stillness pressing into my ears. It wasn't just quiet. It felt like something was missing from the world. The forest wasn't supposed to feel this way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I began to run. Though my legs ached, my breath came in ragged gasps. The forest around me seemed to blur, the shadows twisting and shifting unnaturally. I wasn't sure if it was my fear playing tricks on me or if something was actually happening. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, closer than I expected. My legs locked up, my body frozen as I stood there in the dark, unable to move. The whisper repeated itself, louder now, closer, like someone or something was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. The whisper stopped, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the very air had grown colder. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I stood there, trembling. It wasn't until the whisper returned, right next to my ear, that I broke free from the paralysis. I bolted down the trail, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me. The trees blurred past in a chaotic rush, my breath ragged, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw my car in the distance. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life beneath me. As I drove away from the forest, I realized that I didn't know what had followed me, or why, but something had, and it still felt like it was out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. It was a quiet, ordinary Friday night. I worked at a small local museum, one of those places with dim lighting and long hallways filled with ancient artifacts. The building had a certain charm to it, but by night it felt hollow, lifeless, like the stories of the past were fading into silence. My shift was from midnight to 8 a.m., and most nights were uneventful, just me and the quiet hum of security cameras. That night, everything was routine as usual. I walked through the galleries, checking the displays, making sure everything was locked up tight. The only sounds were the creak of my footsteps and the faint echo of the security system beeping softly. Around 2 a.m., I was in the main hall near the old exhibit on ancient civilizations. The air felt heavy, like it had been pulled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The lights flickered once, briefly, and then returned to their usual dull glow. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the building settling. I glanced at the case with the ancient pottery, its intricate designs worn from years of dust and time. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the display cases was cracked open, my stomach twisted. These cases were made to be impossible to open without the alarm system triggering. The glass wasn't shattered, it was simply opened, carefully. I approached, my breath quickening. The artifact inside, the ancient stone mask, was gone. In its place was nothing but empty air. I called security immediately, my voice shaky. The line crackled, but no one answered. I wandered through the museum, heart pounding as I checked each exhibit. One by one, I realized others had been tampered with. A display of ancient scrolls was wide open, the texts scattered on the floor. A case housing old coins was now empty. The more I walked, the more I noticed. Every artifact was either disturbed or missing. Panic set in. What was happening? Someone had broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of where they'd gone. I turned a corner and froze. The security camera feed on the wall was glitching, the screen flickering wildly. I stared at the screen, my breath catching. The camera wasn't showing the empty hallways it should have been. Instead, I could see something else. In the grainy, distorted feed, I saw figures, tall, shadowy figures walking through the museum. They moved silently like they were gliding rather than walking. Their faces were obscured, but I knew instinctively they were not human. One of them stopped in front of the empty display case where the ancient mask had been. The figure tilted its head as if inspecting the empty space. Then it turned slowly, as though it could feel my gaze, and began walking toward the camera. The screen went black. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no one who could help me. I could feel them in the museum, moving through the darkened halls like ghosts. As I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed, I noticed something else. The air was colder now, colder than it had any right to be, considering the time of year. The faint sound of whispers filled the stillness, voices murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. I wanted to run, but every instinct told me that running wouldn't help. They were already here. I kept walking, trying to find an escape, but everywhere I went, the shadows followed. I realized, too late, that the missing artifacts weren't random. They were gone. Stolen by the figures that had emerged from some forgotten part of the museum. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't from the shadows or from the air. It was behind me, right beside me. Return what was taken. I turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. No sound, except for the whispers, still echoing from the darkness. I didn't know if I was losing my mind, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed out of the museum, sprinting into the night, my breath visible in the cold air. The police came later, of course. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. The artifacts were never recovered, and the museum remained silent. They assumed someone had broken in and escaped, but I knew the truth. Whatever those things were, whatever had taken the artifacts, they were still there, waiting. I've never gone back to that museum, and I never will. I still can't forget that night in the abandoned subway station. It was supposed to be a routine trip home after a long day, but everything felt off from the moment I stepped onto the platform. I had just missed the last train, so I found myself alone in the dim light of the old station. The air was thick with dust, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. There wasn't a soul in sight, and even the usual sounds of distant trains were absent. The station had a strange, heavy atmosphere, as though the city itself had forgotten about it. I sat down on the platform bench, my phone dimming as I glanced at it. No signal. I sighed, slipping it back into my pocket. That's when I noticed the flickering lights. The fluorescent bulbs hummed and flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the tiles. The whole place felt like it was slipping into another dimension. Time passed, or at least it felt like it did. The stillness stretched on and the silence grew deeper. Then I heard something, a soft, dragging noise echoing from somewhere deeper into the station. It was slow, uneven, like someone was shuffling along the tiles. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. I should have left, but something kept me there, my fear rooted in place. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it, a figure. It was tall, gaunt, and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but I could see the unsettling way it tilted its head as if listening. The closer it came, the more I realized its footsteps didn't match any human pattern. They were uneven, like someone dragging something heavy behind them. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked in place. I couldn't look away as the figure got closer. It wasn't until it was right in front of me that I saw it, a faint, hollow glow where its eyes should have been. The smell hit me first, something rotten and metallic. The silence broke into a low, distorted whisper, like the sound of something ancient and wrong. "Leave," it rasped, its voice sounding almost mechanical. "Not supposed to be here." In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed to run, but when I turned to flee, my legs buckled beneath me. The creature was gone, vanished like a memory. The subway station was still and empty once more, the lights flickering as though nothing had ever happened. I got up and made my way to the edge of the platform, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. Even now, I wonder what I saw that night, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to stumble into the darkness. It was a quiet summer evening when my family and I decided to visit the old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, overtaken by weeds and forgotten rides rusting in the hot sun. The locals had always whispered strange stories about the park, rumors of eerie sounds, forgotten laughter, and ghostly apparitions. But we figured it'd be a fun adventure, something different from the usual weekend routines. As we arrived, the first thing that struck me was how still everything felt. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects, just a deathly silence. The entrance gate was broken, hanging open, as though it had been waiting for us. We made our way inside, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing unnaturally loud. The park was larger than I had imagined, with rows of rides that looked like they had been forgotten by time. There was something eerie about the way the rides loomed over us, standing still, lifeless. The Ferris wheel sat motionless, its metal skeleton creaking as though it wanted to move, but couldn't. The funhouse with its broken windows looked like a hollow, crooked mouth, waiting to swallow whatever dared enter. We wandered through the park, taking it all in. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a strange smell, something metallic, mixed with decay. My dad insisted we move closer to the central plaza where the old carousel still stood. It was one of the last working attractions before the park shut down. But it wasn't just the carousel that caught my attention, it was the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, whispering soft murmurs. But as we approached the plaza, I realized the sounds were coming from the carousel itself. A soft, eerie laughter. The kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. Probably just the wind, Dad said, though his voice was quieter now, uncertain. But the laughter continued. Clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The sound came from the empty carousel, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted faces worn and cracked. I could hear them. Soft, childlike giggles, high-pitched and wrong, echoing across the dead park. Mom tried to assure me it was nothing. "It's just the old ride settling," she said, though her voice was shaky. But the laughter grew, becoming more distorted, more human. It didn't sound like kids playing. It sounded like something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was as if something was there, something else. Dad grabbed my hand and pulled me along, saying we needed to leave, but something about that laughter kept following us. We rushed toward the exit, passing the old concession stand. But then, just as we neared the gate, the air grew colder. The silence became louder again, like a vacuum. That's when I noticed it. The Ferris wheel, still sitting there, its broken lights flickering. Only, it wasn't empty anymore. At the top of the Ferris wheel, a figure stood, motionless, staring down at us with hollow, empty eyes. There was no face, no features, just a void where the eyes should be. And that laughter, that awful, distorted laughter, came from it. I turned to my family, screaming to run, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The Ferris wheel lights stopped flickering, plunging the park back into darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We got into the car and drove away as fast as we could, the laughter still ringing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was there, it wasn't human, and it never left that amusement park. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes, empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range miles from the nearest town. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there, watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I'd lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It started on a normal afternoon, a day like any other. I had taken my son to the old park, the one we used to go to when he was younger. The park had always been a peaceful escape from the city, full of tall trees and winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Today, though, something felt off. We had the whole place to ourselves, which wasn't unusual. It was a weekday, and most people didn't visit parks during these hours. I let my son run ahead, chasing after a frisbee he'd thrown. I stood at the edge of a small pond watching him play. The water rippled under the weight of the afternoon sun, and the sound of the birds was soothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see another parent or maybe a jogger, but there was no one. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself, but as I turned back to the pond, the footsteps came again. This time, closer. My son didn't seem to notice, still lost in his game. I told myself I was just on edge. The woods could make noises feel louder than they were, right? But the footsteps weren't fading. They were steady, relentless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had wandered into the park, someone harmless. Still, my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the sound, but saw no one. The footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the pond. My son, still unaware, continued chasing the frisbee, laughing as he ran. "Stop playing," I shouted, my voice trembling now. "We're leaving." He didn't hear me, or maybe he didn't care. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave him. Then, as I stepped toward the pond, I saw something. Something in the water. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure. A shadow, floating just beneath the surface. It wasn't moving like anything natural. It seemed to be watching us. Unmoving. Unmoving. I took a step back from the water, my breath hitching in my throat. What was it? Some kind of trick of the light? My mind raced, but fear took over. I had to get my son. "Come on," I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. My son didn't seem to hear me. He was too far gone in his play, oblivious to the danger I now felt closing in. I sprinted toward him, my heart screaming with every step. I grabbed his arm, pulling him hard. His laughter stopped, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" "We're leaving." "Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. As I turned back toward the path, I saw it again. The figure, this time fully visible. It stood at the edge of the pond, watching us. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. Its form was blurred, not entirely solid, but its eyes were unmistakable. Dark, hollow, watching us. I held my son tighter, running, my breath ragged. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that place. As we reached the park entrance, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless, watching us. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat, racing through my ears. We never went back to that park, and I never looked into water the same way again. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful. winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things, feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else, a faint, rhythmic thudding, soft but insistent, like something hitting the ground, just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Maybe someone's camping out there," Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach. And I never will. I was on a road trip with my friends, driving through an unfamiliar desert. The sun was beating down on the cracked pavement, and the silence of the empty highway stretched endlessly ahead. We had been driving for hours. No signs of civilization in sight, just mile after mile of barren desert landscape. We were all growing restless, desperate for some kind of break from the monotony. The only thing in view was the occasional stretch of cracked road in the distant horizon, where the desert seemed to blend into the sky. My friends and I decided to pull off onto a small dirt track we'd seen about a mile back. The track led to an old abandoned building, once a gas station, now nothing but rubble and dust. The sun had bleached the place dry, leaving only broken windows and faded remnants of faded signage. It looked like it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. "We should check it out," Mark said, breaking the silence. We cautiously made our way through the debris, the crunch of our footsteps disturbing the quiet. The inside of the building was eerily quiet. The dust that coated everything made it feel like the place hadn't seen human presence in a lifetime. We explored the remains, poking through old cabinets and peeling wallpaper, but found nothing of any real value. That's when we noticed it. At first, we didn't know what it was. A faint metallic hum, like something electrical, coming from somewhere deeper inside the building. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't subtle either. We followed the sound down what was left of the hallway, the old wooden floor creaking beneath us. At the end of the hall, we found a door that was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we saw a narrow staircase leading down into a dark basement. The hum grew louder as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, the kind that makes your skin crawl. The basement was a mess. Collapsed shelves, broken tools scattered across the floor. But the hum wasn't coming from any of that. It was coming from an old metal door at the far end of the room. The door was covered in rust with no visible handle. Mark walked toward it, his flashlight shaking slightly as he pointed it at the door. "What is this thing?" he muttered. I didn't know. None of us did. The hum grew almost unbearable as we got closer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I realized there was something on the other side. I reached out, placing my hand on the door. The noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I turned to the others, but they were frozen, staring at me like I was the only one who could move. Then something changed. A faint scraping noise began. It came from behind the door, slow and deliberate, as if something on the other side was dragging itself closer. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark's eyes were wide, his flashlight now trembling more violently. "Open the door," he managed to choke out. I hesitated. I didn't want to. But the scraping was getting louder, the sound of something, or someone, dragging itself across the floor behind the metal door. Without realizing what I was doing, I turned the knob. The door swung open. There was nothing, at least not anything we could see. The room beyond was empty, just more dust, darkness, and a strange, inexplicable silence. But as I stepped forward, I felt something cold, like fingers brushing against my back. It wasn't just a sensation. It was as if something was there, something that didn't belong. My friends weren't behind me anymore. I turned to call out to them, but they were gone. The basement was empty and the metal door was still open behind me. I couldn't explain what happened. I never could. I looked for them after that, searched the entire area, but there was no trace. No sign of my friends, no footprints, nothing. To this day, I wonder what we found in that desert. Whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me, my wife, and our old tent. We had decided to spend the weekend camping at a quiet spot far from town, a remote forest preserve where we hadn't been before. No phone service, no distractions, just nature. We had always loved the quiet, the peace. That night, we pitched our tent by the edge of a small misty lake. The sound of frogs croaking and the distant rustling of leaves filled the air. For a while, everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting about nothing in particular. The forest was alive with sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the scuttling of small animals in the underbrush. But there was one sound that didn't fit. Something soft and irregular, almost mechanical. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was the wind. But then it stopped, only to start again, closer this time. It was a faint rhythmic thud, like someone lightly tapping a tree. I glanced around, but the woods were dark and quiet, save for that strange noise. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "What's that noise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My wife furrowed her brow, listening intently. "I don't know. It's probably just something out there." I didn't believe her. The tapping wasn't like any natural sound we'd heard before. It felt deliberate, almost as if something, or someone, was pacing the perimeter of our campsite. "We should head to bed," I suggested, trying to mask my unease. We snuffed out the fire and climbed into the tent, pulling the flaps closed behind us. The sound followed us. The rhythmic tapping continued, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't far. It was coming from just beyond the edge of the trees, and whatever it wasn't stopping. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every few minutes I woke, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound seemed closer now, more deliberate. The faint rustling of leaves wasn't wind, it was movement. Then something shifted in the darkness. I saw it, a pair of pale eyes staring at us from between the trees. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. I held my breath, frozen with fear. My wife stirred beside me, unaware of the figure just outside the tent. I could barely hear her breathing over the pounding of my heart. After what felt like hours, the eyes blinked and vanished. The tapping stopped. The forest went silent again, but this time, the silence was worse. In the morning, we crept out of the tent, both of us pale and exhausted. The forest was still, but something felt off, unnaturally still. My wife pointed at the ground, her voice trembling. "Footprints," she said. I followed her gaze to the soft earth around our campsite. There were clear, human-like footprints leading away from the tent and into the woods, but they didn't belong to us. We never found out what was watching us that night. We packed our things and left the forest behind, leaving the strange footprints and the silent eyes in the dark. To this day, I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't left. It was late summer, and I'd gone on a solo camping trip, something I hadn't done in years. My usual companions had fallen through, but I felt an odd pull to get away from everything and find some peace in the quiet of the wilderness. I chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day was perfect. The forest stretched out in every direction, vast and untouched. I set up my tent near a small stream, and the sound of running water helped calm my restless mind. There were no signs of other people, no other sounds except for the occasional rustling of leaves and birdsong. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought about how peaceful it all felt. I'd grown so used to the noise of city life, and now, surrounded by nothing but nature, it was like the world had slowed down. I didn't feel the usual anxiety or stress that had followed me in recent months, but as I lay in my tent, drifting off to sleep, I was suddenly jolted awake. Something had rustled outside. I sat up, listening intently. The forest was still, save for the sound of my own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was near. The night passed in silence after that. I convinced myself it was just my nerves. The forest can play tricks on you, and my overactive imagination was likely running wild. By morning, I was ready to forget the incident. But as I broke camp, I noticed something strange. Around my tent, the ground was uneven, disturbed. It looked like something heavy had walked through during the night, leaving deep, uneven prints. I followed the trail they made, huge, unnatural footprints that seemed to lead away from the stream and deeper into the woods. I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears roamed these parts, sure, but the tracks were larger than anything I'd ever seen before. They were too large, the stride too long. I tried to brush it off as fatigue playing tricks on me. That afternoon, as I ventured further into the forest, something shifted. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, became distant, faint. The silence returned, but this time, it was more oppressive. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath. I stopped walking and listened. There was nothing. No breeze, no distant rustling. Just silence. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I realized how alone I was. At first, I thought of turning back, but something kept pulling me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Against my better judgment, I pressed on, deeper into the woods, following the trail of those strange footprints. I don't know how long I walked, lost in thought and the eerie stillness of the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, one that had no right to be there. It wasn't a natural formation, but rather it felt carved out. The trees surrounding it stood unnaturally still, their branches twisting toward the ground as if weighed down by unseen forces. In the center of the clearing stood something I can't fully explain. It was humanoid, though not human. Its form was obscured, shadowy, and indistinct, like it was made of fog. I could barely make out its shape, but its presence felt palpable, almost suffocating. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at it, unsure if I was still dreaming or if this was something real. The creature, if that's what it was, turned its head slowly in my direction. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze on me. Cold, empty, and infinite. Something in its presence made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The clearing was empty once more, as though it had never been there at all. I turned and stumbled back, not sure how far I had come. My mind was racing, the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the silent forest. Every step felt heavier, like I was being followed, though I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached my tent, I didn't stop. I packed everything in a daze and left, not looking back at the deep woods that had become so foreign. I don't know what I saw that day. I've tried to convince myself it was just some trick of the mind, that the isolation and silence had gotten to me. But the footprints, they were real. The figure in the clearing, whatever it was real. I've never gone back to the woods since.
My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. One path stretched ahead, wide and inviting. The other disappeared into the trees, barely a trail. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the less traveled path, the one that felt like it might lead to something hidden, something forgotten. The further I drove, the deeper the trees became, until the road was almost completely blocked by thick branches. My car slowed to a crawl, crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. It was getting darker now, the sun almost gone, leaving behind only the faint light of dusk. I kept going until I reached what appeared to be an old barn rotting wood and a sagging roof. It stood isolated in a clearing, its once bright red paint now faded to a dull gray. Curiosity got the better of me, and I parked beside it. I stepped out, the quiet almost deafening. I walked towards the barn, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The door was hanging open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Dust floated in the dim light filtering through cracks in the roof. It felt as though no one had stepped inside for years. I explored the barn, half expecting to find some long-lost treasure or a relic from a bygone era. Instead, I found remnants of a past that didn't seem so distant. Rusted tools, empty cages, and old hay scattered across the floor. There was something wrong about the stillness. Then, from the far corner of the barn, I heard a soft, rasping sound. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was faint, but distinct, like something was breathing. Slowly, I turned toward the noise, expecting to find nothing but shadows, but there, crouched in the farthest corner, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a dark shape blending with the shadows. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't human. Its form was twisted, its limbs too long and ungainly, moving in jerky, unnatural ways. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't look away. The creature, or whatever it was, stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. Its face was indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Then, it moved. Slowly, as if unsure of itself, it began to rise, its movements erratic, like a marionette with broken strings. I turned and bolted for the door, my breath ragged, the sound of its footsteps echoing behind me died as I ran back to my car. I didn't dare look behind me. My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. It started as a normal evening. My friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned theater on the outskirts of town. We'd heard rumors about the place, things like strange noises, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. Of course, we didn't believe any of it. Curiosity got the better of us, and we thought it'd be fun to check it out. The theater was massive, with peeling paint and faded posters still tacked to the walls. The seats were old and dusty, and the stage loomed in front of us like a forgotten relic of a time long gone. The air was thick, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. It was darker than we had expected, even though the sun hadn't fully set. Our flashlights flickered to life, and we ventured further inside. We split up, exploring different parts of the theater. I wandered toward the old balcony, where decades ago people had watched plays, entertained, and cheered. Now, the place was hollow, empty, and still. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something is lurking just out of sight. As I reached the top of the balcony, I noticed a strange, distant sound, whispers, like they were coming from the seats below. I strained my ears, trying to make out what they were saying. The voices were low, distorted, almost like they were in a language I didn't understand. It wasn't the wind, and there was no one else around. My pulse quickened. I slowly made my way to the edge of the balcony, peering down. Below, I saw shadows moving, shifting in the corners of my flashlight beam. Figures, almost indistinct, sitting in the seats. They didn't seem human, but something far more unnatural, hollow and misshapen, their forms flickering between reality and something else entirely. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back. I ran down the creaking steps, hoping to find my friends. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as if they were calling me, beckoning me toward them. When I reached the main floor, I couldn't find anyone. The theater felt vast, empty, like it was breathing, as though it had swallowed my friends whole. I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. "Guys, where are you?" No answer. I kept walking, deeper into the shadows, until I stumbled upon the stage. The whispers had turned into soft, guttural murmurs. I felt the air grow colder, biting at my skin. As I stood there, the faintest figure emerged from the fog on stage, a shadow, but too solid, too real to be imagined. Its eyes glinted like black glass. It wasn't just a shadow, it was watching me. I backed away, my heart pounding. My flashlight flickered, dying with a dim, hollow glow. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy, oppressive. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone. The murmurs turned into a chorus of whispers. It was as if every shadow in the theater was alive, circling me. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I couldn't run. My legs wouldn't move. My pulse quickened. I slowly made my way to the edge of the balcony, peering down. Below, I saw shadows moving, shifting in the corners of my flashlight beam. Figures, almost indistinct, sitting in the seats. They didn't seem human, but something far more unnatural, hollow and misshapen, their forms flickering between reality and something else entirely. The last thing I expected was to find myself stuck on the side of a remote highway in the middle of nowhere at 11 p.m., with my car sputtering and coughing at its last breaths. I slammed my palms against the steering wheel, trying to stifle a curse. The darkness outside seemed to fold in on itself, thick and oppressive, with only the dull beam of my headlights cutting a path into it. I stepped out of the car, the chill in the air seeping through my clothes. The road stretched on for miles in either direction, bordered by dense, whispering trees. The only sign of civilization was a rusted sign, half hidden by creeping ivy, that read Riverton 10 miles. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help. No signal? Great. The road ahead seemed endless, so I decided to start walking, hoping to find a gas station, a house, anything. I made it about a mile before I heard it. A faint sound, like laughter, but not the kind that comes from joy. This was sharp, guttural, almost animalistic. I froze, my heart drumming in my chest. There was no one around. The woods were still, except for the subtle creak of branches overhead and the soft rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and pushed on. Then the laughter came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy over the ground. I turned around, my eyes searching the dark, but there was nothing. The road was empty. The trees stood silent. I rubbed my arms to stave off the cold and continued walking. Faster now. The air seemed to change as I walked, becoming colder and sharper, like the knife edge of winter. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling of something being wrong. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps following me, just at the edge of hearing. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw only shadows that seemed to shift and dart away. Then, without warning, something moved in the woods. A figure stepped out from between two trees, tall and thin, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its face was pale, almost luminescent in the moonlight, with eyes so black they looked like holes drilled into its skull. The thing tilted its head, and then it spoke, lost. My legs locked up, and I stood frozen in place. I couldn't find my voice, couldn't tear my eyes away from that hollow, grinning face. It took a step forward, the uneven gait making the ground creak beneath it. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure took another step, and I finally snapped out of my paralysis, turning and bolting down the road as fast as I could. The sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind me, matched by that terrible, hollow laughter, drove me forward. The road blurred past, my vision cutting out between stumbles. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my legs were cramping and I couldn't tell if the thud behind me was my own heartbeat or something chasing me. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to move. Then, suddenly, there was light, dim and flickering. A street lamp, old and cracked, stood at the edge of the road. I scrambled toward it, the warm glow embracing me, a sanctuary from the cold. The laughter and footsteps stopped. Silence. I dared a glance behind me. Heart still racing, there was nothing but the night. The road was empty. The street lamp buzzed and flickered before dying, leaving me in a pitch-black void again. But then, a voice, "Need a ride." I whirled around, eyes wide. A truck sat at the end of the road, headlights on, engine purring. The driver's face was obscured in shadow, but the voice was familiar, as if I'd heard it before, A hand reached out, fingers long and thin, with skin that seemed to tight, to pale. My blood froze as I recognized it. The laughter returned, only it was my own voice, twisted and distorted, echoing from somewhere in the dark. It was meant to be an ordinary day at the beach. I had been looking forward to it all week. The sun, the sound of the waves, the smell of salt in the air. I left the city early with a few friends, and we drove out to the coast. It was early enough that the beach was empty, just the way I liked it. We set up our towels, unpacked snacks, and played music while the waves rolled in and out. As the sun climbed higher, we swam and joked, letting the waves carry us like we were kids again. The water was colder than usual, but it felt refreshing against the sweltering heat. After an hour or so, I noticed something strange. Just past the line where the water met the sand, there was an area where the waves seemed to break differently. It looked as if the water was churning, moving in slow, jerky circles. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. He was flailing, waves crashing over him, pulling him deeper. I pushed forward, the water tugging at my legs, and reached out. I grabbed his arm, but when I tried to pull him closer, he went rigid, staring past me, eyes filled with pure, unbridled terror. "Don't turn around," he screamed, voice choked and panicked. I froze, but I couldn't stop myself from turning my head. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark shape had emerged from beneath the water. It moved as if it were made of liquid, its surface shifting and undulating like oil. To hollow, black eyes stared at me, and I could feel its gaze, icy and ancient. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. He was flailing, waves crashing over him, pulling him deeper. I pushed forward, the water tugging at my legs, and reached out. I grabbed his arm, but when I tried to pull him closer, he went rigid, staring past me, eyes filled with pure, unbridled terror. "Don't turn around," he screamed, voice choked and panicked. I froze, but I couldn't stop myself from turning my head. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark shape had emerged from beneath the water. It moved as if it were made of liquid, its surface shifting and undulating like oil. To hollow, black eyes stared at me, and I could feel its gaze, icy and ancient. A gaping mouth split its face, filled with rows of jagged teeth. My breath caught, and the man screamed again. He pulled away from me, but it was too late. The water shifted, and he was gone, dragged under in an instant. The surface of the water settled as if nothing had happened, leaving only ripples behind. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the water, and scrambled to get out. I didn't even look at my friends, who were now staring at me, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I ran up the sand, heart pounding, the air around me thick with salt and panic. I didn't stop until I was safe in my car, locked inside, staring back at the beach. The ocean was calm again, nothing out of the ordinary, as if the man and the thing in the water had never been there. But I'll never forget the sound of his last scream or the black, hungry eyes that had looked at me from beneath the waves. They were still there, waiting, just below the surface. I had been driving for hours, taking the long way home from a visit to my grandparents. The farmland stretched out on either side of the road, a patchwork of fields that seemed to go on forever. With every turn, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers reaching out to catch me. I was almost home when I noticed the old, rusted tractor sitting off to the side of the road. It hadn't been there before, and I found myself slowing down to take a closer look. The engine was covered in dirt, and weeds had grown up around its tires, like it had been abandoned years ago. I couldn't remember ever seeing it there, and I would have remembered, because I had driven down that road countless times. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if someone were watching me. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark figure standing behind my car. The road was empty, and the fields were quiet except for the rustle of dry corn stalks in the wind. I scoffed at myself, muttering that I was being paranoid, and drove on. Just as I was about to turn onto my street, a strange noise caught my attention. It was a rhythmic thumping, like someone pounding on a hollow drum. I pulled to a stop, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The noise seemed to be coming from the field to my left, where the corn had grown tall and thick, forming an almost impenetrable wall. I stared into the dark expanse, my pulse quickening. The thumping was joined by an odd, gurgling sound, like water bubbling up through mud. A shiver raced down my spine as I realized the noise was moving, shifting closer to the road. I backed up a few feet, my eyes wide as I watched the edge of the field ripple like the surface of a pond. Then I saw it, a figure, distorted and half hidden by the corn stalks. It was tall, hunched, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach twist. I slammed the car into reverse and peeled away from the field, the thumping and gurgling growing louder behind me. My tires skidded as I spun around the corner and raced down my street. I didn't dare look back, but my rearview mirror showed the edge of the field, swaying as if something large had stepped into the road. My hands were shaking as I pulled into my driveway and jumped out, not waiting for the car to come to a complete stop. The front door creaked as I fumbled with my keys, barely managing to unlock it. I slammed the door shut behind me, pressing my back against it as my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The thumping had stopped, but now there was a new sound of scraping, as if something with long, sharp claws was dragging itself along the edge of the field. I peeked through the window, my heart leaping into my throat when I saw a shadow move past the porch light. It was tall, with limbs that stretched too far, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered coat. I could only see the edge of it, but I didn't need to see more to know that whatever was out there was not human. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the number for the police. The call didn't go through. I tried again, the screen showing a no service message. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming up the steps, slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to think of what I should do. I had no weapon, no way of defending myself. The sound stopped just outside the door, and then a soft, wet thud followed by a dragging sound. I backed away, holding my breath as I watched the doorknob twist and shift, as if something was trying to turn it from the outside. The wood groaned as pressure was applied, and I feared it wouldn't hold. Suddenly, the pressure eased, and the sound of footsteps receded, fading back into the night. My heart pounded, but the silence was deafening. I waited, unable to move, until the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the field in a harsh, bright light. There was no sign of what I had seen. The next morning, I found the front steps littered with long, dark claw marks, deep enough to splinter the wood, and when I looked out at the field, the corn stalks had been flattened, as if something heavy had moved through them. But most disturbing of all was the fresh, muddy handprint pressed against the window. It was just a casual evening stroll through the old part of town. My friend Dan and I were looking for something to do on a Sunday night, so we wandered into the district filled with century-old buildings, antique shops, and strange little cafes that seemed to appear and disappear overnight. The air was crisp, the kind that nipped at your skin, but not enough to make us turn back. We were in the mood for adventure. We found ourselves in front of an old bookstore, its sign creaking as the wind passed through it. The light in the window flickered, casting long, twitching shadows on the cracked pavement. Dan, who loved anything unusual, pushed the door open. A tiny bell chimed, and the musty scent of old paper and leather filled the air. We stepped inside, the creaky floorboards groaning under our weight. An elderly man stood behind the counter, eyes like sunken marbles fixed on us. He didn't speak, only nodded as if he'd been expecting us. Books lined every inch of the walls, the stacks of them towering over us. I turned to Dan, an amused grin playing on my lips. "Find anything interesting?" I joked, Dan smiled back, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. He pointed to a dark corner of the shop where a single book sat on a pedestal. The light from the overhead lamp shone on it like it was special. I walked over and felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The book was bound in cracked black leather with strange, twisted symbols carved into its surface. When I ran my fingers over the cover, a jolt of cold spread up my arm, but I pulled my hand away before I could react. "Don't touch that," the old man said, his voice raspy but urgent. We both looked at him, and I noticed for the first time the way his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the counter. "Why?" Dan asked, voice curious, defiant even. "It's cursed," the old man said. His eyes darted nervously, but his lips twitched into a thin, knowing smile. "You shouldn't be here. Leave while you still can." I turned to Dan, who was now staring intently at the book. His expression shifted from amusement to a strange kind of determination. He reached out and pulled the book off the pedestal, its weight heavy and unnatural in his hands. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and the shadows seemed to stretch out like fingers across the room. The elderly man's eyes widened, and he made a noise like a choked cry. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a deep, bone-rattling thud from somewhere in the back of the shop. Dan and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us dared to move, but the thud came again, louder, closer. Then came the whisper. It was low and guttural, like someone dragging their nails over a chalkboard. The old man's face turned ashen as he whispered, "Run." Before I could move, a figure stepped into view from behind the bookshelf, a man, or what used to be one, with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched impossibly wide. His limbs bent in ways that weren't natural, joints creaking with each step he took. Don dropped the book, stumbling backward as the figure moved toward us, fingers twitching. The air grew colder, and a sickly smell filled the room, something like decay and rot. We bolted for the door, but the whispering followed us, growing louder, more urgent. It was as if a chorus of voices was coming from every corner, murmuring and pleading. We burst outside, the door slamming behind us, and we didn't stop running until we were back in the main street, gasping for breath. The night had taken on a strange, unnatural stillness, and I could have sworn I saw the old man watching us from the window, the book clutched in his hands, eyes wide and terrified. It was only after we caught our breath that I dared to look back. The bookstore was gone, replaced by a crumbling stone wall, covered in ivy. There was no sign it had ever been there. Don and I never spoke about what happened that night. We left town the next morning and never returned. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howls just right, I hear the faint, echoing whisper that still sends chills down my spine. Run. The road to the old farmhouse was long and winding, a forgotten path that cut through fields of tall grass and gnarled oaks. I had never been out to the farm before, but my friend Aaron had convinced me to join him on this trip to visit his grandparents. They were out of town, and he thought it would be fun to spend the weekend there, exploring and getting away from the city. It started out as a joke between us, a way to break up the monotony of our usual weekend routine. But, as the sun sank below the horizon, the light slipping into dark shadows, an unease settled over me. The farmhouse stood on the edge of a field, its old wooden panels darkened with age. Windows that had once been bright and inviting now cracked and dusty. We explored the house in the fading light, peering into rooms filled with old, rusting tools and faded photographs of a family that felt like a ghostly memory. I touched a picture frame that showed a woman and a man with a young child, their smiles warm and familiar. But it was the eyes that made me stop. They looked familiar, almost like they were staring back at me. I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart hammering in my chest. Aaron laughed, his voice bouncing through the empty house. He was already upstairs, calling out for me to check out the attic. I hesitated, but curiosity won. I climbed up, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The attic was dark, suffocating with the scent of old wood and dust. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if someone else was up there with us. "Look at this," Aaron said, holding a dusty lantern aloft. The light flickered, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stepped closer and saw an old, moth-eaten trunk. He opened it, and inside were old clothes, some toys, and a small diary with pages that looked like they could crumble with a single touch. I reached out and flipped it open, not expecting anything more than gibberish. But the words leapt off the page, written in a scrawled, frantic hand. They come when the lights go out. They were the faces of those who were here before. The air around me grew colder, and I heard Aaron let out a sharp breath behind me. The lantern flickered again, and I spun around, the light catching his face. His eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open, but it wasn't just surprise that I saw. It was fear. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old house as if it were trying to break in. A low thud sounded below us, and then a muffled voice, soft but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. My body tensed, and I felt a shiver race up my spine. "Aaron, we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But when I looked at him, he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, something that moved in the darkened corner of the attic. I turned, heart leaping into my throat. The shadow moved, a shape that was impossible and familiar at once. A face. It had the same features as the one in the picture downstairs, but it wasn't a photograph anymore. It was real, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, lips twisting into a grin. I stumbled back, and the lantern fell from Aaron's hands, landing with a crash that shattered the glass and sent sparks skittering across the wooden floor. The room erupted into darkness, but I could still feel it moving closer, slow and deliberate. "Run!" Aaron shouted. We bolted down the stairs, tripping over each other in our panic. The voice below grew louder, now unmistakable a child's voice, singing a lullaby I had never heard before, followed by the soft sound of feet pattering on the floor above. We reached the front door, wrenching it open and stumbling out into the night. The moon was a pale slice in the sky, illuminating the fields that stretched out in front of us. We didn't stop to look back as we ran across the grass, the song still echoing behind us, chased by the sound of footsteps and a voice that whispered my name. When we reached the road, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The farmhouse loomed behind us, its windows dark and lifeless, but I saw something in the window on the second floor. A child's face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide and hollow, watching us as we ran away. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hearts pounding and breathless. I never told anyone what happened that night, and Aaron never spoke of it again. But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone in that house, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who heard the voice. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it. They come when the lights go out. I had never been to the beach during the winter, but that evening, something about the idea of being by the ocean called to me. The sea had a strange, restless energy, even more so when it was cold and gray. I drove down to the shore, the headlights of my car slicing through the swirling fog. There were no other cars in the parking lot, no chatter of people, only the sound of waves crashing like they had a secret to tell. The first thing I noticed was how still everything was. The air felt heavy, almost like it was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, the damp wind biting at my skin, before I began my walk along the edge of the water. The sand crunched under my boots, wet and cold. As I walked, I kept hearing a sound, a rhythmic, faint thumping that didn't belong to the waves. It was as if someone was knocking on the sand itself, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to come from beneath. I paused and looked around. The beach was empty, shrouded in mist, and the moon barely cast any light over the dark water. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the thumping grew louder. My breath quickened as I took a few cautious steps closer to the edge, where the waves lapped at the sand. That's when I saw it, a figure in the water, dark against the gray, moving with the tide. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its head was just above the surface, tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, with no light inside. The figure reached out an arm toward me, fingers curling as if it were beckoning me closer. The thumping was louder now, like a heartbeat in my chest. I stumbled back, heart pounding as I fought the urge to run. But then I heard it, my name, whispered on the wind. I turned, and there, standing just out of reach, was another figure, this one a man, ragged and pale, with eyes wide and wild. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but felt deep in my bones. A sudden wave crashed onto the shore, pulling the figure in the water back with it. For a moment, everything was silent again. The thumping stopped. The mist seemed to part, and the beach was calm, as if nothing had happened. But the man was still there, watching me, his eyes wide with terror and warning. I forced myself to move, turning and running back to my car. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. I could still hear the sound of thumping behind me, growing fainter as I put more distance between myself and the shore. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't dare look back. Not until I was safely inside my car, windows rolled up, engine running. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing on the edge of the water, its head tilted as if it were listening for something. And then, with a sudden motion, it disappeared, leaving behind only the silence of the darkened beach. I didn't go back to that beach, not even in summer. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and I hear a thumping, I close my eyes and hold my breath, wondering if it's the sound of the sea or something else, something that calls me back to the place where it waits. The bus ride was long and uncomfortable, but I couldn't complain. I was finally visiting my grandmother's farm for the summer, a place I hadn't seen since I was a child. My parents said she had been lonely, so I decided to take a break from my busy city life and spend the next 2 weeks out in the open fields. The bus dropped me off in front of the weathered farmhouse, the wood painted appealing red that clashed with the green of the fields. I smiled, inhaling the crisp, dry air, trying to drown out the nagging feeling that I was forgetting something important. Grandma was waiting for me on the porch. Her hair was white, her smile wide and welcoming. We hugged, and she took my bags inside. The first few days were idyllic. Long walks through the meadows, fresh milk from the cows, and evenings spent on the porch as the sun sank into a horizon of tall, whispering corn stalks. But as the days wore on, I noticed the odd things. At night, when the world was dark and silent, I would hear a faint tapping sound, like a pebble hitting the window. I'd wake up, heart racing, and see only shadows in the moonlight. Grandma assured me it was just the wind, or the old house settling, but I didn't believe her. It wasn't just the tapping, there was something else. Something moving in the fields, just beyond the reach of the porch light. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up, breathless, listening. The noise came closer, slow and heavy, until it stopped. My heart pounded. I slipped into my shoes and crept to the window. The moonlight spilled across the land, casting everything in a cold, silvery glow. I gasped when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the cornfield, unmoving. It was tall, impossibly so, with thin limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted back, and its eyes were nothing but dark, hollow pits. I blinked and it was gone, vanished into the maze of stalks. My mind raced. It was too dark, too far for me to see clearly. I shivered, questioning my sanity. Maybe it was just an illusion, a trick of the moonlight. I turned to find Grandma asleep in her chair, breathing steady and deep. But when I looked at the clock, I noticed the time, 3:27 a.m., the same time the tapping had started, the same time the footsteps came. The next day, the sun hung heavy in the sky as I worked with Grandma in the barn. She hummed a tune while she sorted feed, and I thought maybe I had been imagining things after all. But, as the day ended and dusk began to settle, a low rumble in the distance caught my attention. It was coming from the direction of the cornfield. Grandma noticed too, pausing mid-task. Her eyes darted to the field, and a shadow flickered across her face. "It's the crows," she said, her voice unsteady. "They don't like it when he comes." I frowned, puzzled. "Who?" Grandma didn't answer, and I felt a chill spread through me. That night, I sat in the dark, the old house creaking as it settled. The tapping started again, and then, faintly, a low humming sound, like a twisted lullaby. I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sensation of something watching me. I turned my head, eyes adjusting to the faint light, and there it was, the figure from before, standing at the window. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Its hollow eyes met mine, and it moved. Fingers splayed against the glass as if it were trying to press through. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy book, and threw it at the glass. The window shattered, and for a split second, the figure vanished. I ran to find Grandma. I found her at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the dark. She didn't turn to look at me, and when I approached her, I noticed her hand was pressed tightly against the glass, leaving behind a print I couldn't understand. It wasn't the mark of a human hand. "It's here," she whispered, eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen before. "And he's coming back." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Not from the field, but from within the house. Slow, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't need to look. I knew I wouldn't like what I saw. The first night camping under the stars felt like the perfect escape. My friends and I had been planning this trip for weeks, a weekend in the middle of nowhere, away from our busy lives. The campsite was deep in the woods, so far from any road that the nearest signs of civilization were distant and barely audible. We spent the day hiking, laughing, and roasting marshmallows around a crackling fire. It felt safe and carefree, but by the second night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping outside my tent. It was just past midnight, and the fire had long since died down. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a deer. I lay there, trying to convince myself of that, when the sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, reached my ears. They were too close to be any animal, and they were moving in a slow, circling pattern around the tent. I held my breath. I could hear my friends breathing, deep in their sleep, oblivious to the noise. I whispered their names, but no one stirred. The footsteps paused, right at the corner of the tent, and I could feel the weight of whoever was out there pressing against the thin fabric. My heart clenched, and I prayed it was just a trick of the wind. But then I heard it, a voice, hoarse and guttural, whispering words I couldn't understand, right next to the tent. My pulse quickened, and I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it blindly into the dark. The beam caught nothing but the warped outline of the forest. Still, the voice whispered on, an echo that seemed to come from all sides, almost as if the trees themselves were speaking. My fingers fumbled as I unzipped the tent, telling myself I needed to check for the source of the sound. The forest air was colder than it had been before, sending a shiver down my spine. The night was pitch black, but the moon was bright enough to cast a pale, wavering light over the campsite. I found myself staring at the empty clearing where the fire pit once smoldered, its embers now cold and gray. But what caught my attention wasn't the darkness or the silence, it was the tall figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible, but impossible to ignore. It was thin, impossibly so, with limbs that bent in angles that should have been impossible, and it was staring at me, eyes like black holes drawing me in. I gasped and backed into the tent, yelling at my friends to wake up. They stirred, disoriented and confused. I tried to tell them what I saw, but my voice was trembling, too weak to make sense of. They glanced outside, their eyes wide with fear as they noticed the figure wasn't alone. From the shadows, others began to emerge, moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait. Their limbs seemed stretched beyond reason, and their mouths opened in silent, inhuman screams. We bolted from the tent, grabbing only what we could and running into the night. The figures followed, their footsteps dragging behind us, so much slower than ours, but relentless. We didn't look back, not even when the trees began to thin and the sounds of our pursuers grew distant. We ran for hours until we found ourselves at the edge of the woods, panting and terrified. The first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. We couldn't speak, couldn't make sense of what we'd just seen. But we knew one thing, those things were not of this world, and they were still out there, watching. It wasn't until we made it back to our car and drove far away from that place that we dared to turn around. The forest, with its twisted, dark trees, loomed behind us, silent and still. But on the edge of the clearing, just visible in the morning light, was that same figure, standing motionless, a dark, gaping hole for a face staring straight at us. And then it raised one long, thin arm and pointed. I was always the adventurous one. My friends would hesitate to try something new, but I couldn't resist. That's how I found myself at the edge of the old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. A place where kids once screamed in delight on the roller coasters, and the smell of popcorn mingled with the scent of cotton candy. Now it was nothing more than a resting skeleton of forgotten joy. It was late in the evening, just past twilight. The air was crisp and smelled of the city. mixed with something older and damp. My friends were hesitant, but agreed to follow me inside. We stepped through a gap in the fence, the iron links jagged and twisted. It wasn't as creepy as I'd expected, at least at first. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its painted wood faded and peeling, but the gentle creak it made as it swayed in the breeze seemed almost alive. We wandered from ride to ride, each one more decayed than the last. The bumper cars sat in their little enclosure, rusted, unmoving, their paint chipped and the windows cracked. We joked about the rides coming to life and scaring us, but the laughter was hollow, even to my ears. It was then we heard the first sound that made me stop in my tracks. A high-pitched giggle, faint, drifting from behind the funhouse. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, not since childhood, when the park was still alive with laughter and lights. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I turned to my friends. They looked just as uneasy. "I think we should go," one of them said, but I brushed it off. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We moved towards the sound, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with us. The giggle came again, louder, and I swore I saw something move behind the funhouse mirrors. I stepped forward, the creaking wood beneath my feet sending a jolt of nerves through me. The door to the funhouse was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. As I pushed it open, the air inside was colder, sharp and biting. The mirrors on the walls reflected our faces back at us, fragmented and twisted, making us look distorted and monstrous. But there was something else in the mirrors, something moving just out of sight. The way it moved felt wrong, jerky, sudden, as though its limbs didn't bend the right way. "Did you see that?" I whispered. The others nodded, wide-eyed, but no one spoke. We pressed on, each step louder than the last, our breath shaky and uneven. The giggling grew, a child's laughter that seemed to echo in 1,000 directions. A sudden crash behind us made us jump. I spun around, flashlight trembling, and the beam swept across the mirror at the end of the hall. For a moment, I saw it small, with dark, wild hair and eyes too big for its face. It wasn't a reflection. It was real, and it was watching us. We bolted, running past the cracked mirrors and worked carnival games. The laughter followed, sharp and manic. It didn't fade as we reached the entrance. It grew louder, as if we were being herded into a trap. We leapt over the fence and didn't stop running until we were back at the main road, panting, hearts racing. When we looked back, the amusement park stood as silent as before. No laughter, no shadows moving. The night felt suddenly to quiet, like it was holding its breath. I turned to my friends, trying to catch my own breath. "It was just a trick," I said, but the look on their faces told me they didn't believe that. None of us did. That was years ago. I don't go near the park anymore, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that giggle. It's faint at first, just a whisper in the dark, then louder, like it's in the next room, behind the wall, as if it's always been there, waiting. And sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, something small and watching, with eyes too big for its face. I had never been one for city life. So, when my friends invited me on a spontaneous day trip to the countryside, I jumped at the chance. We packed a picnic, hopped in a car, and drove for hours, leaving the noise and pollution behind for rolling fields and the fresh scent of wildflowers. The air was different out there, light and cool, and it made me feel freer than I had in years. The fields seemed endless, a patchwork of greens and yellows, with a lonely barn standing at the edge, worn down and forgotten. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in an old photograph, the kind where the grass has a slightly wild look, like it's been waiting for a long time to be noticed. We parked by the barn, unloaded our food, and set out to explore. I was the first to find the small, withered path that led to a cluster of trees at the edge of a clearing. I followed it with my friends, and soon we found ourselves standing in front of a pond, the water as still as glass, reflecting the sky like a giant mirror. We spent hours there, laughing and taking turns skipping rocks, the sun sinking lower in the sky as we began to feel the cool of evening. That was when I noticed something odd, a small shack, half hidden by overgrown ivy, in the distance across the pond. None of us had seen it before. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. My friend Anna squinted, her brow furrowed. I don't think it was there before. It was true. I felt like I would have noticed a building like that, something that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. We debated whether to check it out, the setting sun casting long, wavering shadows across the grass, but curiosity won out. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the shack, each step making the forest feel denser, the air colder. The shack was in worse shape than I expected. The roof had holes where rain had leaked through, and one of the wooden slats was missing from the wall, revealing a dark interior. A foul smell came from inside, like rotting meat, and I felt my stomach twist. "Hey, maybe we shouldn't go in," Mark said, his voice faltering. He looked pale, his hands trembling. "It's probably just old junk," Anna said, trying to sound brave. I nodded, but my throat was dry. I took a breath and pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. The room was dark except for the thin beams of light from our flashlights. Dust settled on everything, from the tattered curtains to the broken chairs. But what made me freeze was the wooden figure in the corner dot. It was a crude carving of a person, hunched over, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grimace. Its limbs were shaped like twisted branches, and there were strange carvings all over its body, symbols I couldn't read, but that made my skin crawl when I looked at them. I tried to move, but the door slammed shut behind us, so hard that it cracked the frame. We all jumped, exchanging terrified glances. I reached for the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The air grew heavier, as if someone or something was pressing against us from the outside. Anna gasped, pointing at the figure. The eyes, which had seemed so hollow before, now looked like they were watching us. The carved mouth opened, letting out a sound that was half a scream, half a groan. We all screamed and scrambled for the door. But when we turned back, the figure was moving, stepping toward us with an unnatural, jerky motion. It stopped when it reached the threshold, tilting its head like a curious animal. My heart pounded as we burst through the door, the night air outside feeling colder than before. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, our lungs burning and our legs aching. As we drove away, the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the shack, and standing in its doorway was the figure, watching us with those hollow eyes that never blinked. I never went back to the countryside. None of us did, and even now, years later, I never forget that face or the feeling of being watched, as though something unseen still follows me, waiting for the day when I'll go back and see it again. I wasn't planning on going to the market that late, but I had run out of the one thing I couldn't live without: coffee. The corner store by my apartment was open 24 hours, and though I knew it was late, I wasn't worried. It was just a short walk. I pulled my coat tighter around me and pushed my way into the crisp night air, the moon casting pale shadows across the empty streets. The store was well lit, but eerily quiet when I stepped in. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced at the lone cashier, a man with tired eyes who barely acknowledged my presence. I moved quickly to the aisle where the coffee was stocked, distracted by the strange silence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The air smelled stale, and there was something metallic, almost iron-like, mingled with it. I grabbed my usual brand and headed to the counter, the sound of my footsteps louder than they should have been. The man behind the counter glanced up at me, and a flicker of recognition passed in his eyes. Before I could say anything, he nodded slowly and reached for the register. "Don't go near the woods," he muttered, so low I thought I must have imagined it. "What?" I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. He looked at me, his gaze sharp and wary. "The woods? Don't go near them after dark. Not tonight." Before I could respond, the door swung open behind me, making me jump. A gust of wind pushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and something sharp that made my head spin. A tall man stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the harsh lights of the parking lot. He was dressed in dark clothes, a hood pulled over his head, and he didn't move as he looked straight at me. I froze, but only for a moment. The cashier's voice cut through the air. "Leave, now." The man didn't respond. His eyes, dark and glistening, shifted from me to the cashier. He stepped forward, a sound like scraping nails following his movement. I took a shaky step back, knocking over a can of soup that rolled across the floor with a metallic clatter. "Hey," I shouted, but my voice felt thin, swallowed up by the silence that pressed against the walls. The man stopped moving, his head tilting slightly, as though considering something. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the night. The cashier's hands were shaking as he locked the front door, eyes wide. "You need to go," he said, grabbing his coat. "It's not safe." "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just pulled me toward the door, his eyes darting to the shadows beyond the glass. I followed his gaze and saw them figures moving in the dark. Impossible shapes that flickered and shifted in the moonlight, too quick to focus on. My chest tightened as I realized what they were. The stories my grandmother used to tell me came back with a rush. The things that roamed the forest after dark, the ones that could mimic the living, but with a terrible twist. They hunted not for food, but for something far worse. "Where do we go?" I whispered, my throat dry. The cashier grabbed my arm, and for the first time since I'd seen him, his face softened. "Away from the woods, no matter what you hear. Don't look back." We ran, the sounds of the forest coming alive behind us. There were footsteps, whispers, a sound like branches snapping underfoot, and then a sudden, piercing screech that cut through the night. I couldn't stop myself from glancing back. Even as we turned the corner and ran down the street. There was nothing there, just the empty road, the glow of street lights, and the darkened forest in the distance. But as I turned away, I caught a glimpse of something in the shop window. A pale, twisted face staring out at me, eyes wide and open, a grin carved into its features. It wasn't the man who had entered the store. It was something else, something waiting for night to claim it. The park was beautiful that evening, with tall oaks and maple trees casting long, dappled shadows across the worn walking paths. It was a popular spot, nestled between the city and a sprawling riverbank, filled with joggers, families, and old couples who liked to feed the pigeons. I had been there countless times, but that day felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and a strange, damp smell clung to the breeze. I was walking alone, headphones in, trying to shake off a bad mood that had settled over me all day. The path twisted through dense thickets, and the chatter of nearby park goers faded into the background. It was growing darker, and a chill seeped into my bones. I checked my watch just past 7 p.m. The sun had dipped behind the trees, painting the sky a bruised purple. I should have turned back, but I didn't want to go home, unless yet. Then I heard a soft whisper that seemed to brush against my ear. I yanked out my headphones and looked around. The park was still, empty save for a pair of joggers far off in the distance and the occasional flutter of wings from the trees. I told myself it was just the wind and kept walking, but the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. It was a voice, almost melodic, saying one word over and over, "Come." It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stopped, scanning the path behind me, but there was no one. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and took a shaky breath before continuing forward. The path narrowed and curved into a part of the park that I had never explored before. It was eerily quiet. No sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just that insistent voice, drawing me in. My heart pounded, but curiosity won out. I stepped off the path and into the underbrush, where brambles clawed at my jeans. The whisper led me deeper, away from the familiar trails. A clearing appeared, shrouded in shadows and framed by old stone statues of animals cracked and overrun with ivy. In the center stood an old fountain, water dry and choked with moss. But the most unsettling part was the girl. She was sitting on the edge of the fountain, her legs folded and her head bowed, as if lost in thought. Her hair was dark and unkempt, tangled with leaves and twigs. "Hey," I called hesitantly, my voice cracking in the silence. The girl didn't move, but I felt her gaze on me, even before she lifted her head. Her eyes were wide and vacant, too large for her face, rimmed with dark circles. And then she spoke, her voice so cold it made my blood freeze. "Not safe here," she whispered, but her lips didn't move. Before I could react, I heard the crunch of twigs behind me. Spinning around, I saw a figure emerge from the trees, a tall shadow with long, spindly limbs. The silhouette stepped forward, and the light of the moon caught its twisted smile. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. The girl stood up, her movements jerky, as if she were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. She looked at me, and in that instant, I knew she wasn't just warning me. She was trying to protect me. Run, she mouthed, and the shadow lunged. I didn't think, I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I broke through the trees and stumbled onto the main path. I gasped for air, looking back. The shadow had stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching me, but it didn't follow. The girl's silhouette stood behind it, her head cocked to one side as if waiting. The park lights flickered back to life, and the world around me settled into the comforting hum of the city. I turned and ran in the direction of the nearest street, every step echoing with the rush of my heart. When I finally reached the street, the voice whispered one last time, "Safe, but only for now." I didn't go back to that park, not ever. And now, every time I hear that whisper, a shiver runs through me. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing for certain. There's something in that park that follows those who listen to the whispers. The first time I noticed something was off was when I walked into the old public library. It was the middle of the day, yet the atmosphere was heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of dust and decay, with a hint of something sweet that I couldn't quite place. I usually loved the library, the hush of turning pages, the creak of wooden floors, the musty scent of old books, but that day felt different. I wasn't alone. A few people sat scattered among the aisles, some flipping through books and others simply staring blankly at the walls. I wandered past the rows of bookshelves, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as if in sync with my growing unease. As I passed a section of history books, I heard a faint whisper. My pulse quickened, but when I turned, there was no one around. I let out a nervous chuckle and shook my head. I had been up all night studying. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I moved deeper into the library, drawn to the old, oversized books in the corner. As I reached for one, a chill ran down my spine. The book was open, resting on a table, pages yellowed and stained. But it was the words that caught my attention. "Don't look behind you," I scoffed, dismissing it as some sick joke. But as I glanced over my shoulder, the whispering started again. This time, I heard it clearer, as though it was spoken directly into my ear. "Don't look behind you." I spun around, heart pounding, and locked eyes with an elderly man sitting across the room. He was hunched over, his gnarled fingers playing with the edge of a book, eyes glistening with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the look in his eyes, it was the way he seemed to lean forward, as if trying to warn me. But his lips never moved. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the air, a rustling like pages being turned. I whipped around to see that all the books around me had fallen open, their pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. A cold draft swept through the aisle, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something metallic. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The man's voice came again, clearer this time, though still soft and broken. "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off, plunging the room into a silence so deep it felt suffocating. I stood in the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just a power outage. My breathing echoed off the high ceilings as I reached for my phone, only to find the screen was dead. A soft, steady tapping began behind me, a rhythmic sound like fingernails on wood. I turned, and in the darkness, a thin, shadowy figure stood at the end of the aisle, just at the edge of the light from the window. Its eyes were wide and hollow, and a grin stretched across its face, too wide to be human. Panic surged through me, and I bolted toward the exit, stumbling through the rows of books as they fell around me. I could hear the whispering behind me, growing louder, weaving through the air like a song I couldn't recognize. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw the figure moving toward me, feet gliding silently over the floor. I didn't stop running until I was out on the street, gasping for air as the sound of whispering finally faded. I dared to look back once, but the library was dark, as if nothing had happened at all. I swore I could still hear the faintest voice saying, "You should have listened," to this day. I never go near that library again, and when I pass it, I can still hear the soft, whispering voice calling out from inside, warning me of the one thing I wish I'd known. Once you hear the library's secrets, you can never leave. The night my world changed started like any other. My friends and I had decided to take an evening trip to the old observatory on the hill. It had been closed for years, abandoned. The last astronomer mysteriously vanished. Rumor had it the place was haunted, but we were young and reckless, ready for any thrill. We didn't believe the stories. The climb up the hill was steep and damp from an earlier rain, the air thick with the scent of moss and pine. The observatory loomed above us, its weathered stone walls cracked with age and covered in ivy that reached out like fingers. The sky was clear, a tapestry of stars, and the moon cast a ghostly glow over everything. Inside, the observatory was dark and silent. The main dome creaked under the weight of time, the giant telescope pointing skyward like a skeletal finger. We wandered through, laughing and daring each other to explore deeper into the building. It wasn't until we reached the old basement that things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped, and a metallic scent filled the air. We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity pushed us forward. The basement was full of old equipment, charts, and abandoned papers scattered like leaves. At the far end was a door, half open, with the faint light seeping through the cracks. Before anyone could stop me, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, cluttered with old photographs and a large, moth-eaten chair. But the strangest part was the mirror. It was an antique, with a frame carved from dark wood and intricate patterns that seemed to twist if you looked at them too long. I stepped closer, feeling a chill creep over my skin. "Hey, come on," Emily called from behind. "Let's get out of here." I nodded, but as I moved, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Only, it wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. It grinned, but it was not my smile. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. "There's something in the mirror," I whispered. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the air felt thick, as if something were pressing against my chest. A sound, like the faintest whisper, moved through the room. My friends crowded around, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What is it?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. Before I could answer, the reflection in the mirror changed. It was no longer just a face, it was an entire scene, a vivid replay of a moment I didn't recognize. A man, hunched over and gasping, in the very room we stood in. His reflection stared at me, eyes wide with terror, as if he knew I was watching him. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, fingers splayed, as though trying to pull me in, get away from it. Emily screamed. I wanted to move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room shuddered, the floor creaking as though it were about to split open. A cold wind surged past me, carrying with it a voice that echoed in my mind. "Help me." I snapped back to reality, stumbling away from the mirror as it cracked, the glass shattering in a spray of sharp, jagged pieces. The chill lifted, and the room returned to its stillness. My friends were staring at me, fear radiating off them like heat. "What did you see?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. I looked around, not sure how to answer. The air felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the mirror was still there, waiting for me to return. We left the basement without speaking, the silence heavy between us. When we finally stepped out into the open night, the stars above felt colder, the moon more watchful. I never went back to that observatory, none of us did. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch my reflection in a dark window and see a pale, hollow-eyed face grinning at me from the glass. It's not just a reflection, it's waiting. The street was dark, except for the occasional flicker of the street lamps that barely cut through the night. I had taken the long way home from my friend's house, down the quiet back roads that winded through patches of woods. The air felt heavy, and the silence outside my car was suffocating, as if the world were holding its breath. I was about halfway home when the car's headlights caught something, a figure standing at the edge of the road. I hit the brakes, the tires squealing in protest as I stopped just inches from what I now saw was a woman. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her hair was dark, tangled, and her face was turned away from me, looking down at the pavement. I rolled the window down, the cold air biting at my skin. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice uncertain. The woman didn't move or respond. I squinted, trying to make out her face, but the shadows hid it. A chill ran through me, but I told myself I was being silly. Maybe she was lost, maybe in trouble. Just as I was about to call out again, she turned. The face that met my eyes was pale and cracked, like an old porcelain doll. Her eyes were black and hollow, and the corners of her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. My heart clenched. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse and sped away, glancing back in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing still, unmoving, watching as the distance grew between us. The last thing I saw was her head tilting to the side, an unsettling, broken motion. I didn't take the usual way home after that. I drove faster, glancing over my shoulder, ears straining for the sound of footsteps, or worse, the whisper of someone breathing behind me. The radio crackled, the only noise besides the sound of tires on pavement, and I twisted the dial, searching for something that would chase away the tightness in my chest. Suddenly, my headlights caught something else, another figure, this time in the middle of the road. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his hair matted and eyes sunken. He raised a hand, motioning for me to stop. I didn't. I slammed my foot on the gas, my car roaring as it sped past him. In the rearview mirror, the man and the woman stood side by side, staring. A sharp, inhuman cry broke the night, and I couldn't help but shudder. The road ahead was dark, unlit except for the dim glow of the moon. I turned left at the next intersection, taking a path that led deeper into the woods. I knew it wasn't the right choice, but the thought of going back that way was worse. The trees pressed in on me, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull me out. I drove faster, ignoring the warning signs that read dead end. I didn't care. I had to get away. But as I rounded the bend, the road stopped abruptly, and the car skidded to a halt at the edge of a shallow, rocky ravine. I slammed my hands against the wheel, breathing fast, eyes darting around. In the darkness, I saw movement. 3 figures, no longer at the edge of the road but in the clearing behind me. Their faces were pale, eyes dark and hollow. The woman in white stepped forward, and a voice, soft and cold, whispered from the shadows, "Leave this place." I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into drive and sped forward, ignoring the gravel bit at the tires. The figures didn't follow. I didn't look back as the trees blurred past, but I knew they were watching, waiting, and whatever they were would always be there, hidden in the dark corners of the woods. The rest of the drive home was a blur, my mind screaming for me to stop thinking, stop looking over my shoulder. When I finally made it to my house, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me, and drew the curtains tight. The world outside was safe, or so I thought. The next morning, when I went to leave for work, I noticed the street was silent, as if it had never been touched by light or life. And when I looked out the window, I saw the woman in white standing across the road, staring at me, eyes hollow, mouth cracked in that twisted grin. I knew I'd never be the same again. The silence outside whispered that they were still there, waiting for the night. I was visiting my grandfather's old farmhouse for the first time in years. The place had always been abandoned since he passed, but after years of avoiding it, my family decided it was time to clear it out. I wasn't expecting much, but something about that house made me uneasy the moment I stepped onto the overgrown property. The farmhouse was large and creaky, surrounded by nothing but fields and distant woods. It looked like something straight out of a horror story. Wooden siding withered and worn, windows cracked, and the door hanging on rusted hinges. My parents, my siblings, and I split up to sort through the decades-old belongings scattered around. There were stacks of dusty boxes, old furniture covered in tarps, and layers of cobwebs hanging in corners. It smelled like mildew and age. I wandered upstairs, away from the others, to explore the bedrooms. Each room was filled with relics of the past, faded photographs of relatives I didn't recognize, yellowed books, and cracked mirrors reflecting empty rooms. I didn't like the silence. It felt oppressive, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. In the master bedroom, I found an old chest at the foot of the bed. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it open. Inside, I found old letters, some faded and crumbling, others half legible. Most were addressed to my grandfather, signed with names I didn't know. But one letter stood out, handwritten, crisp despite the years. "Whoever finds this, beware. There is more in this house than dust. Things linger here. Things that shouldn't be. I froze, reading it over and over. It wasn't signed, just a vague warning. Shivers ran down my spine. I told myself it was just an old family superstition, nothing more, but the words stuck with me. Later, after everything was packed, we all gathered outside to say goodbye. As we stood there, the sky grew darker, clouds rolling in from the distant horizon. My parents were talking about calling it a day, but I lingered, staring at the house. The silence returned, but it felt heavier than before. Just as I was about to walk away, I heard a soft, unmistakable creak. The sound came from inside the house, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight. My heart jumped into my throat. I spun around, expecting someone to come out, but no one was there. I stayed still, my breath shallow, as the creaking continued. It wasn't just a sound, there was something behind it, something inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. It wasn't human, more of a shadow, long and gaunt, peering through one of the upstairs windows. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the ground. The shadow remained there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, until finally, it vanished. The creaking stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally turned back to my family, they were already halfway to the car. I followed, my heart still racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside the house, something that had never left. The old amusement park had been closed for years, but I decided to go with my friends that evening. It was a dare, a way to break the monotony of our lives. We sneaked in through a broken gate, and for a while, everything felt thrilling and forbidden. The rusted rides creaked in the wind, and the faint, sweet scent of candy still lingered in the air, a memory from a long-gone summer. As night deepened, the park felt more alive. The lights from the Ferris wheel flickered, as if trying to send a signal. We laughed nervously, daring each other to go further. We were all teenagers, invincible and foolish. The sunken bumper car arena had its roof caved in, but we walked through it anyway. I noticed a handprint on the window of one of the cars, smudged and dirty, and felt a shiver race down my spine. "Stop being so paranoid," Jenna said, brushing past me. Her flashlight beam swept across the dark space, revealing torn vinyl seats and long-forgotten stuffed animals. I was about to say something when I heard a faint giggle, too high-pitched to be anyone in our group. My head snapped toward the sound, and I saw nothing but the shadows. Did anyone else hear that? I whispered, my voice a bit too sharp. They laughed, a sound too loud in the silence. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, but there was doubt in his eyes. We pressed on, past the carousel, which was missing half its horses and now stood as a skeleton, creaking as if it were laughing at us. When we reached the funhouse, the cracked mirror tiles reflected distorted versions of ourselves. We stepped inside, the air damp and thick with the smell of mold. It was colder in there, as if the night had crept in and wrapped its arms around us. "Why did you want to come in here?" Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. "To see if it's really haunted," I replied, half joking. I ran my fingers over one of the mirrors, feeling the smooth glass beneath my fingertips. A cold draft made me shiver, and as I turned around, I caught a glimpse of something behind me, a figure, pale and thin, with eyes like black holes. Before I could scream, it was gone. "Did you see that?" My voice cracked. "What?" Mark asked, eyes wide. "Never mind," I muttered, trying to shake off the fear. We were all laughing, but the laughter felt hollow now. We pushed deeper into the funhouse, the laughter now tangled with the sound of footsteps that were not our own, echoing behind us. We tried to leave, but when we turned, the hallway twisted, like a giant snake blocking our path. We ran in the opposite direction, pushing through the maze, but no matter which way we went, the hallways seemed to stretch forever. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of rot and something metallic. Then, the giggle returned, closer this time. It wasn't one voice, it was many, overlapping and deep, as if the shadows were laughing at us. The sunken bumper car arena had its roof caved in, but we walked through it anyway. I noticed a handprint on the window of one of the cars, smudged and dirty, and felt a shiver race down my spine. "Stop being so paranoid," Jenna said, brushing past me. Her flashlight beam swept across the dark space, revealing torn vinyl seats and long-forgotten stuffed animals. I was about to say something when I heard a faint giggle, too high-pitched to be anyone in our group. My head snapped toward the sound, and I saw nothing but the shadows. Did anyone else hear that? I whispered, my voice a bit too sharp. They laughed, a sound too loud in the silence. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, but there was doubt in his eyes. We pressed on, past the carousel, which was missing half its horses and now stood as a skeleton, creaking as if it were laughing at us. I didn't look back, couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me every time I close my eyes. I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't human. The sun had long since set, leaving behind nothing but darkness. I carried a flashlight, but barely needed it, as the faint glow of the moon guided me enough. The beach was deserted, just the way I liked it. I walked for what felt like hours, letting my thoughts wander with the rhythm of the tide. The waves lapped gently at the shore, creating a hypnotic sound that had always brought me a strange sense of calm. But that night, something felt off. The air wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, a nagging sense of unease growing with each step. It wasn't until I reached the far end of the beach, where the sand met jagged rocks and the sea stretched out endlessly, that I noticed it. A figure, not far from where I stood, barely visible in the dim light. There was someone or something standing still, staring out at the ocean. I froze. My first thought was that it was another walker like myself, maybe someone else who had come to enjoy the solitude of the beach. But as I tried to make out more details, my stomach twisted in knots. The figure didn't move, it was just standing there, unmoving, as if frozen in time. The longer I stared, the more I felt the weight of its gaze. Though I couldn't make out any features, a chill ran down my spine. But I told myself to keep walking. There was no reason to panic. It could have been anyone, right? But as I took a step forward, the figure shifted slightly, turning ever so slightly in my direction. It wasn't a human movement, there was something unnatural about it, jerky and deliberate, like a puppet controlled by strings. The urge to turn and flee was overwhelming, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding. The figure continued to stare at me. There was no recognition, no sign of life, just that unrelenting, lifeless gaze. Then, without warning, the figure took a slow step forward. My body finally responded, and I turned and ran. I didn't look back, couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me every time I close my eyes. I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't human. I've always been fascinated by old places. So, when I found out about the abandoned theater on the edge of town, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. My friends weren't as keen on the idea, but curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go alone. The theater was a relic of the past, built decades ago during a time when the town was booming. Now, it sat in near total darkness, the once grand marquee faded and cracked, half buried by overgrown weeds. The air felt thick as I approached, the weight of silence pressing down on my shoulders. The inside was just as eerie as I'd imagined. The faded red velvet seats were torn and tattered, scattered with years of dust. The stage, where once performers had entertained crowds, was now a hollow expanse of broken wood and scattered debris. I made my way cautiously to the middle of the floor, the old floorboards creaking underfoot with every step. The smell of decay lingered in the air, mixed with something else, something almost alive, breathing in the shadows. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating bits of faded murals on the walls, ghosts of a time when the theater had been vibrant. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams or the distant scurrying of what I hoped were just rodents. As I explored, I felt a strange sensation creep over me, an unease that wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the abandoned state of the place, there was something else in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. I was near the front of the theater, near the stage, when I noticed something strange. A faint, flickering light appeared at the edge of my vision. I turned toward it, the flashlight beam catching the edges of an old, tarnished mirror that had been propped up against the wall. The reflection in the mirror wasn't right, blurred and distorted, like someone had smeared the glass with dirt. But in that smear, I thought I saw a face staring back at me. I blinked, but the face remained motionless, expressionless. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, but the face in the mirror followed my every move. I couldn't look away. My gaze locked onto the figure that wasn't quite human. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the dim light. Its mouth was cracked, a grin frozen in time. Panic surged through me as I stumbled away from the mirror, my heart pounding. I backed into a chair, knocking it over. The sound echoed through the empty theater, and suddenly, I felt as though some presence was watching me. I rushed toward the entrance, desperate to escape. But as I reached for the door handle, the flickering light appeared again. It was closer now, glowing softly in the darkness. My flashlight went out, leaving me in complete blackness. I fumbled with the switch, but no matter how many times I clicked, it refused to turn back on. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, slow, deliberate, like they were dragging something heavy. The smell of decay lingered in the air, mixed with something else, something almost alive, breathing in the shadows. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating bits of faded murals on the walls, ghosts of a time when the theater had been vibrant. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams or the distant scurrying of what I hoped were just rodents. As I explored, I felt a strange sensation creep over me, an unease that wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the abandoned state of the place, there was something else in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. I was near the front of the theater, near the stage, when I noticed something strange. The evening sun dipped low, painting the sky in a wash of orange and pink as I stood in the middle of the field, staring out at the sprawling farm. The summer harvest was winding down, and I was finishing up my last task, picking a few late-season tomatoes. The air was warm but carried a faint, bitter tang that didn't sit right in my throat. I glanced around, trying to push the feeling aside. There was no reason for it. The farm was my sanctuary, a place where nothing could go wrong. I'd been working on my uncle's farm for years. It was familiar, predictable, and usually quiet except for the crows that would squawk and wheel in the sky. But tonight, something was different. The field behind the barn was where I always finished my day. I loved the rhythmic rustle of the tall corn stalks and the occasional cricket chirping, a sound that calmed me down after a long day. But today, the corn didn't move with the wind. It stood still, like it was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. "Hey, are you out there?" My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better, but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something. Fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. "Uncle," I called, my voice shaking. He was already running towards me, but he stopped when he saw the arm. His expression shifted from concern to confusion, and then to something else I couldn't name. His eyes widened, and he glanced toward the woods before meeting my gaze. "You need to get inside now," he said, his voice low and rough. Before I could ask why, the arm pulled back into the cornfield, and a wet, spluttering sound followed. It was as though something was dragging itself, the thud of its movements muffled by the earth. The corn rustled violently, then fell silent again, a suffocating hush settling over everything. My uncle grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the porch. "Inside," he said, more urgently this time, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. A scream tore through the air, sharp and strangled. It wasn't human. It was like an animal, but worse, deeper, guttural. My body froze, but my mind raced, fighting the instinct to run. I glanced back toward the field, my uncle's grip digging into my arm. There, standing at the edge of the corn, was a figure. It was pale, emaciated, its limbs too long and crooked. It didn't have a face, just a void where I should be, a black, empty space that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Then it moved, not toward us, but sideways, disappearing into the woods, the corn behind it shivering as it passed. I staggered back as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. "Hey, are you out there?" My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better, but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something. Fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. "Uncle." I was on my way to visit an old friend who lived on a small farm at the edge of town. The directions he gave were simple enough, and the scenery was beautiful, the hills rolling and dotted with wild flowers. But as the sky deepened to a dusky purple, a strange feeling crept up my spine. The road twisted and turned, narrow enough that my car brushed the bushes on either side. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving together like a canopy, blocking out most of the light. I knew I was close, just a few more bends, when something caught my eye. A figure stood at the side of the road, half hidden in shadow. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, and my heart leapt into my throat. The figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a man, but his body was bent at an unnatural angle, as if he were being held up by invisible strings. His arms hung limp, fingers brushing against the dirt. His head turned slowly, jerking around as if on a swivel, and his eyes met mine through the glass. The look in them was not human, black and wet, with a depth that seemed to reach inside me and pull. I couldn't breathe before I could scream or drive away. He raised one arm and pointed directly at my car. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I hit the gas, speeding around the curve and desperately trying to tell myself it was just a hallucination or some poor, lost soul. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, but I ignored it. I needed to get to safety, to the farm, to my friend. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw him there, just behind the car, staring with those black, soulless eyes. I blinked, and he was gone. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of the farm, I slammed the car door and ran up to the porch. The house was quiet, dark with no light spilling through the windows. I knocked, my knuckles hitting the wood like a drumbeat. No answer. Panic clawed at my chest, and I knocked harder, shouting his name. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, searching the dark yard. The air was damp and cold, and I could see my breath curling in the faint moonlight. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a movement of figure stepping out from behind the barn. It wasn't my friend. It was him, the man from the road, his body still bent at that unnatural angle. He stepped forward, and as he moved, his limbs made wet, snapping sounds. The same dark, black eyes stared at me. Before I could run, he raised his arm again and pointed a gnarled finger toward the house. The light in the window flickered and blinked out, leaving only darkness. The air seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating, and the yard was filled with a sound I can only describe as whispering hundreds of voices, too quiet to make sense of, but the tone was unmistakable. I turned and bolted for the door, twisting the handle until it nearly broke. Inside, the house was still dark, cold, as if no one had lived there for years. I swept my phone across the room, and its light illuminated something that made my blood freeze. On the wall, written in what looked like smeared ash, were the words, "He's waiting for you." I'll never forget the day my family decided to take a trip to that old, abandoned amusement park. It was a place I had heard of, but never thought we'd visit. Set deep in the woods, far off any well-traveled roads, it was a relic from a bygone era, crumbling and overgrown with weeds. Most people said it was dangerous, but my parents thought it would be an adventure for us kids, something different from the usual summer trips. From the moment we parked the car, I felt a strange chill in the air. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to muted grays, and the silence that filled the place felt oppressive. The park looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet something about it didn't sit right with me. My sister, laughing, tugged at my arm and insisted we explore. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, something waiting. At last, I found my sister, huddled near what was once the park entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard them," she whispered, "the voices. They're everywhere." We stayed there, holding onto each other, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, circling us, the laughter echoing in the distance. The old amusement park seemed alive, every creak of the wood, every rustling breeze sounding like a warning. When my parents finally found us, hours later, we were sitting together, too terrified to speak. The voices had faded, but the sense of something lingering had not. We never spoke about that day again. The amusement park remains hidden deep in the woods, abandoned, but the whispers, those remain with us, even now. My sister ran ahead, laughing and calling to me, until I couldn't hear her anymore. That's when the whispers started. I was sure I was imagining them at first. Soft, almost inaudible voices carried through the empty air, faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I froze, listening intently, but there was nothing to see. Just the towering remnants of the old rides, the stillness, and that chilling silence. "Sarah," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I tried again, louder this time. "Sarah, where are you?" A knot formed in my stomach. I told myself she must have wandered ahead, but the fear wasn't about her. It was the way the park seemed to pulse around me, the silence now heavier than before. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a faint voice, soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "Turn back." I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. There was nothing but the empty Ferris wheel, its great skeletal arms stretching into the gray sky. I stood there, waiting, but there was nothing, only the wind stirring the dust around my feet. "Hello," I asked, but my voice sounded thin and distant, swallowed by the emptiness. Suddenly, the sound of laughter filled the air, high-pitched, childlike, but hollow. It echoed through the park, bouncing off the old rides, each bounce seeming to come from different directions at once. I ran, my legs moving faster than they ever had before, calling out for my sister. The laughter followed, growing louder, closer. I stumbled over twisted metal, fallen beams, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had returned, louder this time. "Come closer." I wanted to scream, to run, but the park had become a maze of rusted remnants. The ground was uneven with debris. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, something waiting. At last, I found my sister, huddled near what was once the park entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard them," she whispered, "the voices. They're everywhere." We stayed there, holding onto each other, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, circling us, the laughter echoing in the distance. The old amusement park seemed alive, every creak of the wood, every rustling breeze sounding like a warning. When my parents finally found us, hours later, we were sitting together, too terrified to speak. The voices had faded, but the sense of something lingering had not. We never spoke about that day again. The amusement park remains hidden deep in the woods, abandoned, but the whispers, those remain with us, even now. The old house at the edge of town had been abandoned for years, its peeling paint and sagging roof a grim testament to better days. My friends and I dared each other to go inside on Halloween night, convinced the tales of the ghostly woman in black were us stories meant to scare children. The moon was full, casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement as we approached the house. The air was chilly, and a strange stillness hung over the neighborhood, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart thump louder. We pushed open the front door, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust coated the floorboards, and spider webs draped the corners like sinister lace. The old house at the edge of town had been abandoned for years, its peeling paint and sagging roof a grim testament to better days. My friends and I dared each other to go inside on Halloween night, convinced the tales of the ghostly woman in black were us stories meant to scare children. The moon was full, casting a pale glow on the cracked pavement as we approached the house. The air was chilly, and a strange stillness hung over the neighborhood, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart thump louder. We pushed open the front door, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust coated the floorboards, and spider webs draped the corners like sinister lace. My friends froze, eyes wide and breaths caught in their throats. We exchanged nervous glances, and then the giggle came again, this time closer. The floorboards creaked behind us, and we spun around to see a shadow at the end of the hall. It moved, quick and fluid, vanishing into a dark doorway. Without thinking, I started after it. The others shouted for me to stop, but I didn't listen. My feet carried me down the hallway, past faded portraits with eyes that seemed to follow me, until I reached the doorway. The room was dark, but a small, flickering candle on the floor cast a dancing light across the walls. It was surrounded by torn papers and strange markings, like some kind of ritualistic symbols. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something in the corner. It was a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained with what looked like dirt or something worse. The giggle returned, this time louder, and I spun around, heart racing. A woman stood in the doorway, her face obscured by a black veil. The air thickened, heavy and suffocating, and my flashlight flickered. The woman reached out, her fingers thin and gnarled, with nails as sharp as broken glass. I stumbled backward, but the floor caught my foot, and I fell hard against the wall. The others burst into the room, their eyes wide with terror. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, staring at us with eyes that seemed to bleed from behind the veil. Then, suddenly, the candle blew out, plunging us into darkness. I heard shuffling, quick footsteps, and then a loud thud. My flashlight flickered back on, revealing the others scrambling to their feet, panting and terrified, but the woman was gone. We ran out of the house, the front door slamming shut behind us as if held by an unseen hand. We stood there, breathless and shaking, staring at the old, creaking house. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. As we looked around, I noticed something horrifying. The window of the ballroom was wide open, and staring back at us was the child's doll, its cracked porcelain face split into an unsettling smile. We never went back. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the wind howls just right, I swear I hear that giggle, soft and echoing, from somewhere in the dark.